Hello.
Hello. Hi, Jesse.
Hi, Al.
Hi,
Uh,
listeners.
Hello, and welcome to a very special and
Hmm.
especial. There's something British in there. I'm remembering something. Anyway, um, a transatlantic exploration of I don't know what the fuck I'm saying anymore. Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 40 of Radio Free Golgotha. This is it. We are out of the Jesus limbo. You know, the rain is ending, and the ammonia smell on the ark has gotten highly untenable. Um, but we have reached episode 40, which is not remarkable for someone who puts out a podcast every week or every month, but we, as exceptionally unpredictable, have taken since 2017
Yeah.
to get to episode 40. But I will say that without hopefully bad lucking us in any way, inadvertently evil eyeing ourselves, which is the best type of evil eye there is, we have done an episode every month this year, including the portended episode 40 of October. So as long as we get two more out, we have reached an entire year of episodes monthly, which has been wonderful for the dopamine fix that is my life's purpose. Uh, but also just nice to see and talk with Al once a month and hopefully provide something of interest to at least the listener we know we have.
Yeah, it's fun to think about being 40 episodes old, definitely. Yeah, like you said, out of the 40 episodes in the wilderness, by next month at least. Yeah. Get to
And
have an awesome midlife crisis now.
yeah, absolutely. Well, plenty, plenty. If the average age in the States is what, 76, 75, 76, like we're past, we're in the throes of it right now.
Imagine
Also
if our
this
midlife crisis was being like even more organized and regular. Wow. That'll
I
stick it to
mean,
past me.
yeah. When does adulting begin? When we notice it hasn't.
Oh my
Uh,
goodness.
But so what is this more for us, Golgothites, is we're doing an exploration of the show itself on this episode 40. So rather than specific saint, demon, herb, stone, magical genre, geomantic figure, tarot, or dead magician, we are exploring those concepts itself, talking about the show a little bit, our shortcomings, because it's a shortcoming.
Our long comings as well,
Our long,
definitely. Our long, long
and
walks on short
our
tangents.
yeah, absolutely. Looking at where we'd like to go and possible plans for future episode design, which is really not that different, because we like what we do and we enjoy the eternal pub that seems to be the backdrop of this show. So,
For sure,
welcome
yeah.
and hold on to your butts.
It's an oops all magics of episode. So yeah,
Yes,
talking about
absolutely.
the magics of saints and hagiography, the magic of demons and demonology, magic of herbs and herbalism, magic of minerals and lapidary, um, bestiary, bestiary, magic of styles, techniques, and types of magic themselves, magic of geomancy itself, magic of cartomancy, and the magic of dead magicians, and more broadly, this this thing of ours we call folk necromancy, and
Yeah.
inclusive hours. Hopefully, I would add. And it's nice to do this in October, where we can kind of work off the Hallowstide and the All Saints and All Souls to consider, yes, All Saints and saints and sainting,
But
and
not all saints, as it were.
but not all saints. Yeah,
Yeah, I think it's a
hagiographic
perfect
blur and
segue.
hagiographic clarity.
Yes, blur, clarity across the board, and the demonic blur and clarity that we've explored in the past of many things. So, I guess we can start with saints and hagiography and the magic of saints and sainting, as it were. We have chosen to use this as the sundial of our episodes, right? This is the stellar year, which is the par course for the solar year here, being as it is, and the convenience of that grand, is it a large C or a small C, Catholic Church, and the calendrical procession of the saints, as it were, allows us to focus on a specific, well, it's a saint, but what exactly is a saint? That's part of what we're going to talk about today, I suppose, and always have talked about. Because one of the critiques has been in the past that we are sometimes not. It's interesting because as pagan friendly as we ourselves are, so there's there's a saint right away, and we do this Golgothite thing, and what does that mean, and the blur of that, and as self-identified, Chicano and Latino, like I can't hear you over Catholicism, for the merging of pagan and Christianity, as far as just understanding it's a Catholic worldview and everything exists in it. That is the cultural background, but also that the idea of what makes a saint, as far as the lovely, lovely heresy that is the power blood of many witchcrafts, and the witchcrafts I like to lick the most. Um, but to use and understand something as prominent as a saint, which has a worldwide following, that on this day we are seizing the power of that saint, and what can we, as magicians, as witches, as carcists, as whatever we call ourselves or not, how do we tap into that and use it to our advantage? How do we build and co-create the world of tomorrow using the focal point that is accessible to us today? So is it as much as stealing the saint's power? It might be. Is it as much as falling in line and doing dual observance so that we can look like, a lovely little 50s glossing of normalcy over everything? Perhaps there's power in that too. There's power also in the blatant understanding that things survive, and if life will out, then magic will out as well, and people will always find a way to bend fate to their will. Either that's, to me, that's the born witch side. Like when they say a witch is born, not made. There are people that will not settle, and there's a divine restlessness that is in there. That the blood that crawls with snakes, or even the saint that bleeds ink, as it were, for greatness among people. Like we are rewriting that which has been cast. Nothing is so sacrosanct except that we are born and we will one day die, and even that's up for debate until it happens to each one of us, right? Al might
Yeah.
be the first person to live forever.
I might give it a go. I might give it a go. That whole vampire ennui about oh, that nothing means anything when you have endless infinity ahead of you. I got books to read. I got so many books I haven't got through yet. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know.
And anyone who criticizes our book hoarding does not understand what our ideal retirement is and how we want to start it now.
Exactly. And again, thinking about not just the weird haunted objects I want to leave, but the actual library of resources for that people can bicker and argue about at my awesome wake.
No, my instructions clearly say to anyone who survives, you light it all on fire. Glorious blaze, Balenciaga all the way.
So this is I mean, it's time again, our great nemesis and benefactor and womb and tomb, right? And that's what I very much like about, like you said, emphasizing the calendricals of saint days and saint feasts, and not just the saints themselves. And that's great to light some beacons and keep us on track and have some milestones throughout the turning of the year. And it's also, again, it's a great crossover of the old ways and the less old ways, in terms of we've talked about saints, but we have done some stuff that's like Ash Wednesday, that's like Candlemas, which obviously have saints and a wealth of hagiography to them, but they're also about the observances that happen then. Sometimes some very economic ones, that like Michaelmas was a rent day, that kind of stuff. And so again, not just treating saints as these kind of free floating entities in a void of in a kind of astral plane of the past, but like linked to particular seasons, linked to particular organizations of people, things that happen then, the social life of those who seek the saints, as well as the icons and the relics themselves. So yeah, I think it's really great to talk about what it means to observe, and indeed, like you say, to kind of jailbreak the liturgical calendar a little bit, and to put some faces to the days.
I think the rectification of the supposed linear time we are, especially in a Christian narrative of AD and BC in their calcified forms,
Mm.
um, to then understand that mankind inherently thinks of time through a much more linear way, and through a cyclical way. Wow, I just fucked that shit up right there. Through a much more cyclical way. I do think we think of ourselves as aging, but the fact that the seasons happen and there's this recurrence of anniversaries and things like this, especially in the temperate zones, right? That where 4 seasons are very active.
Yeah.
It's a very curious thing to investigate conceptions of time and seasonality across the different distances from the equator and the poles, because it's as you approach the equator, time is perceived of very differently than those
Yeah.
who are going to deal with 6 months of darkness. Uh, but all of that to say is that the the container of Christianity, and specifically the older church, meaning the Catholic and the Orthodox, um, with imposing these saints on a round like this, allows you to merge the seasonal local celebration with the more codified saint anniversary of when that saint goes into heaven, right? The greater feast, as it were.
Yeah, that we find ourselves, or that we find things beginning again. Like this is when, you know, the apple trees start appling, right? And that we can find ourselves beginning again along with them in various ways. Yeah, I think that's really powerful.
As you pointed out in the past too, that these are markers to tell by which are we behind or ahead.
Hmm.
In that if the Saints' Day is going to be acknowledged generally on the same day, although if it is a greater celebration, it might extend into a weekend celebration and it might be really, quote unquote, fully celebrated for a week or 2 weeks. But sometimes these celebrations of tides were also to align with, we don't know when the apple blossom is actually going to happen, or we
Yeah.
don't know when the sheep will actually start lactating.
Hmm.
So it's somewhere in here and gives a measure to the year of like, what do we have to do? What, not only what in the very, and I hate this word, but it's used anthropologically of primitive way of like what has to be done magically, prayer wise or petition wise to the higher powers to make nature go back on its course.
Mm.
But on a very practical level of like, don't have a big feast yet with all your wares when the winter is still blaring outside. Just because it's spring doesn't mean that the weather has changed. Uh,
Right.
and
Right.
so
It's St. Peter's celebration when we celebrate St. Peter, and if it's pissing it down outside, and you need stuff on the village green, then you know you're not hidebound. You're not hidebound to a quantifiable specific time of minute or hour or day. It's Peter tide when it's Peter time.
yes. I think the notion of what makes a saint, which we is of interest in itself, because we could posit that our dead magician is as much a saint, just by being spoken about in that same way as a Catholic saint that nobody cares, quote unquote, cares about, if that unless they are Catholic or
Absolutely. Yeah,
um,
absolutely. This notion of like the sacred dead is the other like huge part of why I love getting to do these like hagiographic explorations with you. Yeah, I'll big up again like the way you've talked about. I don't think you've used these words exactly, but the idea of like the sacred poltergeist dynamo of like doing things to saints that we would normally that would normally be like, you want restless dead, this is how you get your restless dead, right? But they're not, but they might be restless, but they're also encouraged to be on some kind of like church dynamo
you
doing.
want to sleep, bitch? Perform a miracle. Yeah.
Yeah.
I have
The
denied you
reward
the
for
kingdom of
good
heaven.
works is more good works, right?
Yeah, yeah, good works, good works. You come to do good works,
Uh-huh.
as
Uh-huh.
we joke with spirit songs. I think the process of canonization is an interesting thing to reflect upon as far as our own understanding of dead magicians too, because right, like you go through this quote unquote servant of God area where when someone is identified as a possible saint, they're classified as a servant of God and they perform a council. There's a tribunal and a congregation for the cause of the saints that happens where the person, the servant of God, so and so, is investigated, and they make an acta, a formal documentation of, well, the tribunal does, that is then passed on to the congregation for the causes of the saints, and then this, the decree of holy heroic virtues happens, then they can become venerable. And this usually is, of course, around their active life. You do have to perform miracles in this greater story, one, two, or none if you are a martyr. Um, So there's the decree of the heroic virtues of the servant of God, which is when they're venerable. Then the first miracle that's proposed,
Mm.
and that first miracle is in depth in modern era, very in depth investigated. And that's
Mm.
not to say that there's not bias in there at all, but the whole idea of it is that it's beyond science and beyond reasonable expectation that this thing has occurred,
Right.
and that there is also a belief that the congregation can provide support for this miracle happening. And this is why older saints are not denied their sainthood. This idea that saints are taken off of the calendar
Mm.
not mean that they're not saints. It means that their public celebration is less celebrated. Yeah, that was great words there. I'm sorry. But they're so are they demoted? No, but they are not calendrical anymore. So this the miracle itself then gives way to the blessed, right? The beatification, which is the second miracle is supported in this case, which gives way to the decree of the miracle, and the Pope declares canonization, where they are entered into the full calendar of the church. You can also be a local saint where you are venerable and you are chosen to be or beatified, excuse me, and you are chosen to be celebrated locally, but not on the universal calendar.
Mm.
I think that breakdown, in the same way that we're looking at saints as a model here for anything, is good to give credence to, or not credence, but to lend an eye to on how to model our own ancestralization of dead magicians, because I think that one thing that is rushed on is the making of someone a saint immediately when they've died. A
Mm.
saint or these things develop culturally over time, because that the value center that that person's dead egregore or spirit or whatever is engaging in is of service to a larger community. It is not just grandma is a saint to her family and therefore she is a saint to everyone. So
Right.
understanding of locality and contextualization and the great onion layers of relevance is
Mm.
important, as well as I think this understanding, if we're going to go from like just the let's look at like Foucault's Stations of the Sun and Robert Farris Thompson on Congo cosmology of like the sun that is death that is on the horizon, and then the setting sun is not the sun of the ancestors, which is straight down the sun at midnight. And this ancestralization process happens where the person is stripped of some of the things in their life, some of the memories, and their spirit becomes one with the ancestors, which is a different thing to be an ancestor than to be dead.
Right.
And some things maintain their singularities as dead things, and some things join ancestral covenants or groups where the ancestors speak as one voice a lot in many traditions. I think that that itself is something that's of use to study, because there is, in the modern parlance, someone dies, immediately they're like, the Saint candles are made. And that's fine, but we're not allowing that person to die. We're actually
Mm.
keeping, and this idea of keeping the memory alive, we're so, this weird kind of mix of death is a part of life, but then we're not going to allow them to die.
Yeah.
And like, it's okay to let some things go, like where, at least in the various worldviews we're engaging with, that it's actually limiting the person to deny them that death. And in many traditions where you don't actively call on the person outside of funerals, for a year, even 3 months
Right.
to a year, and various ceremonies are done to allow you to speak that name back into existence without calling to the spirit and not allowing it to transition to an ancestral realm or to wherever else it's going. Um, they say
Right.
funerals are for the living anyway, right?
Yeah. 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 Right. That transition is important. Yeah. As I think we've said before, like moving is stressful, right? Like you need a
Yeah.
chance to unpack your stuff and to work out what got put in what boxes and to work out if you really need this thing anymore. And giving people a chance to do that before we start laying out things and asking them to influence the living world again.
Mhm.
Seems, yeah, like you said, it's important to give them a chance to finish dying.
Yeah. I think
Mm.
there's also that exploration that can be had of a greater understanding within the necromantic impulse that many of us have, of understanding that some people are dying before their actual death, and some
Mm.
people are so strong in their trajectory that they are still learning to die after their death.
Mm.
And I think that one of the things that, as far as one who believes in the cycles of life or sees that evidenced around me more than the finality, that I would like to encourage myself and the people that are around me that are supporting this belief or that have similar beliefs, of like encouraging the cycle nature of it and allowing things to ancestralize and to come again if that's their job or their trajectory. I mean, ultimately, what the fuck do any of us know about the afterlife? That's all
Yeah.
as much as anybody else. So there's culturally bound things and things that like it's also fascinating in that way that old habits die hard, and what people are exposed to as a young child will determine how their magic as an adult works. Uh,
Mm.
we've talked about that and jokingly on the show, like, that's very prot of you. And prots are going to prot. And in the same way that, papists are going to papists, we're going to be this weird thing. Even if we don't believe in the authority of the Pope as the sole thing, there's still the colonial mindset that's there in Catholicism. Again,
Mm.
for Latin America of like, it's a Catholic universe. Everything can exist inside that, but we accepted that they were the conquerors long ago. Doesn't mean you can't rebel and kill them all. It
Right.
just that's the history, and that histories are meant to be rewritten, especially if you're the winner in the end.
And especially if you've got the time to do that. Yeah. And the
Time and the access
resources.
and the privilege and the resources, or just the sheer I don't have anything to lose anymore.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah. That's
the
true.
if you go into like the archive and the just reperformance of what history is, of again this clash of recorded history and repeated history that is reifying the recording, but also slowly can change it and move the window of
Yeah.
that when you go into that understanding of it.
Yeah.
Similar,
I think that's one of the things that that inspires me about things that might be called saint work is this idea of not just the great people of history, but also that when we light that candle, like who else gathers about who also considered that saint an inspiration or prayed to them, that like there's a commonality with the unspoken congregation, with the unknown pilgrim and things like that.
yes, absolutely. And I think in the same way that there is the archive of history, right, and as it moves forward, um, as it's the repertoire of performance that happens, following kind of Diana Taylor's theories there, that the performance of the saint within the year starts to change the saint from its original descriptor. And
Yeah.
that's part of what we're engaging in is the shifting of this to be applicable and to understand this is what was done through the Christian model in Europe and beyond, where it was this is no longer the saint means the saint isn't no longer living for themselves. The
Yeah.
saint is now intercessor. The saint is now grand mediator of the archive and the repertoire of the stasis of heaven and the endless, boundless living light that is there, and those that have to exist in the shadow play of earthly life. Um,
Right. Right.
so,
Between top down canonization and bottom up folk veneration.
yes, yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And
Yeah.
when we go into folk veneration, we'll get into that heavily, I'm sure, with dead magicians as well, and just talking about folk necromancy. But the so many of our pre-congregation saints they're folk veneration, and a
Right.
lot of them you had to be martyrs, and this is that you're dying for your faith. That actually interests me the least. Although I love a bloody martyr, I love a bloody saint. Absolutely. Give me first communion over the Ecce Homo, like body of Jesus. Just yes, that's like. Um, there's some trauma in there for Catholics of the very traditional bent, but man, it makes some really fun imagery. Uh,
It scratches the itch.
yeah, it scratches the itch, the itch that the crown of thorns just puts into my little face.
Hmm.
Um, so I guess the thing of this, the beauty of this is that we get things like um, people talking about witch saints or fey saints or any number of saints. The fact that we can say there is a patron saint of necromancy, which is not true, and yet it is true.
Yeah.
Because what is a patron saint? There's no official list that says what a patron saint is a patron of. It's
Yeah.
what the people put upon that saint. And so
Mm.
patron lists are negotiated. And then in the same way that we're going to explore, I'm sure, with other topics, the calcification where nomenclature and description become definition
Right.
is something we're fighting against in actively you and I in our praxis, but also hopefully on the show of like, nothing has one definition. There is not just one saint, patron saint of cattle or patron saint of toothaches. Although, if you give it to me and it's Apollonia because her teeth were ripped out, we often give saints this idea of patronage based over how they were tortured,
Right.
or unique ways. And it's really just looking for any clue that this could be a saint that might have any sympathy for me.
Right. 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 It's all historiola, right? The ancestry of ritual precedents themselves, and like that itself is looking for a handle to find how this problem and this tension gets to be a way that we can grasp a helping hand.
Can you succinctly, and this is where I go, question of impulse, I suppose. Would you be willing to describe hagiographic blur, in a succinct way? Because it's something we talk about on the show. We have talked about it, and I think it's identifiable by context, but it's also such a really great concept to explore in the magical, witchy way of understanding saints.
Totally, yeah. I can give it a stab for sure. So it crops up when we start to see that one Saint John starts to be associated with the heraldry or the actions, or even, quote, confused with another Saint John, for instance. So this idea of like they are blurring together, that in folk memory, in even in official practices, to varying degrees throughout history. But what's interesting about this is that we start to see that there are value centers. We start to see the shifting of the particular figurehead of a value center. So yes, we start to see that different names are elided, but they're also already invoked, right? To say Cyprian the Saint is to, especially with those pictures, is to draw on both that of Carthage and that of Antioch, right? Like whether implicitly or explicitly saying they were the same, or merely pointing out that like it's still the same name, that when you call out to Saint John, like you're potentially, there's a bunch of different Johns that could answer. There's that side to it. There's also this side of how folk memory isn't just fallible, but like flexible. And that, like, especially when we get into the inverse hagiographic blur that's associated with necromancers, with black magicians, with people, with witches to a certain extent, of the memory that there was someone who did weird stuff in this area is often far, far older than the latest name we give to it. One of the good examples of this, I think, is the illustration of the two dudes in the graveyard summoning the ghosts, sometimes in a circle, sometimes without, that for a very long time has been said to have been possibly a reimagining of Dee and Kelly, because this is an image that crops up in Paul Weaver's Ancient Monuments of 1623. And so it's already after Dee and Kelly have been doing their due. It's set to be in St. Leonard's Church, or near Pendle. So there's a whole bunch of witch stuff there already. And what we see is that, 50 years after the fact, we've got Kelly's name associated with it, but the actual legend of someone summoning ghosts there is hundreds of years older. And so hagiographic blur, whether saint or sinner, often is a way of not exactly updating, but of being in more tangible memory and having more detail and having more of a handle on things to be able to articulate some far older mysteries, often of landscape or of, like I say, value centers. I think that's roughly how I've been thinking about it of late.
Yeah. And building on that, I would say, like, quick definition of value center that we've talked about. Like, I was first for the term by Niebuhr's Radical Monotheism in Western Culture, where specifically Niebuhr's looking at it from a Christian angle of placing a value center so high, quote unquote, or how would I say that? That in radical monotheism is that there can be only one value center, that God is so high that he is beyond value and being. Whereas the normal emphasis in everyday life is that we have a value center of what's important to us, whether that's the solidity of the family unit as security, or the fact that we are this is a coastal people, and so they might have a value center that is heavily built around fishing, and as the source of sustenance. You might have value centers where the mines that they brings wealth to their community start to be a value center, but things are going to have to shift around these different value centers, and something coming in. And one of the reasons that Christianity was able to convert many was by placing God as a very high value center that was above these other minor value centers, where saints took those places, and various gods were replaced by saints because nothing was really changed. It was translated at best into a Christianese, and the gods of the old became the saints of the new, not as clearly said to be the demons of the new. In fact, you can look at it kind of like a split personality, that in order to conquer and convert, you could not erase a value center. You had to assume it into what you were trying to do. So it is translation, which is not an exact science by any means, unless you're a monolingual person and then you think it is. But thus the fallacy of the monotheist, perhaps. We're just going all over the place. Anyway, value center in that way If you're a fishing village, you might take on some Saint Peter because he's a saint associated with fish. But it's I think each cultural expression of this, yes, it can be planned. Yes, it can, and we know that it was planned in some instances by certain Christian theologians coming in. Oftentimes, it did arise out of folk expression, or a new saint would evolve that answered the needs of the value centers of the people. And this is because it's hard to, when you're coming into an area, you have no idea what's going to be, you're not able to predict necessarily what the people need. It's an analysis, and sometimes it's very successful to say, you know who I think you people would like? I'm giving you this saint. Whereas other times it's just like, oh, I didn't know about this festival that seems to happen every middle of May, and the saint on our calendar, they're like, well, that's what we're doing. That's
Yes.
the saint.
Yeah,
So,
the winter solstice isn't eradicated; it's co-opted, or
yes.
we could say colonized, maybe as
Yeah.
well, or at
In the
least
same way that you could say that all languages are equally old,
Mm,
even new constructed languages because they're building upon what we know of old languages.
mm,
But the idea that like which language is the oldest, well, they've all evolved out of different forms of some ancestral language that we don't speak anymore.
yeah.
So yes and no and yes and no but yeah but no but no. Uh,
Which we also see with this idea of the singularity of a saint, right? Like that there are these different streams that saints are like are blurred and elided and are also kind of separated out at points, like that we don't get the single manifestation that like is that fairy saint, is that sorceress saint the same as the church doctor that it was based on, right? I've been thinking about this with Albertus Magnus a bunch in terms of like the difference between the historical figure and the mythic writer of all these books of secrets, and the fact that that's extra complicated by like a bunch of more recent research on how like no he didn't talk a lot about it, but he was like, oh yeah, no, I tested this stuff with magic and it worked. And the yeah recent the text on disenchanting, Albert has been talking about how really what this becomes then is how different people treat these kinds of asides he has of like trying to incorporate him as a respected thinker and a voluminous writer into what counts as magic and what doesn't. But that's again how he's used and received and transmitted, which again starts to build up whole other onion layers and shadows and yeah, occasionally some kind of quite sort of yeah schizophrenic kind of multiple personalities based on this one figure and how different people have approached and the things that they have left at those conceptual altars that then start to alter how the next set of people are interacting with them as well.
yeah. Yeah, as you're talking, it made me realize we've done similar things on the show, even of there are times where we pick the saint because one of us has a desire to like, oh, that's a saint I want to talk about. There are other times where we pick the saints solely because they fell, usually at the end of the month, which gave us longer to record the episode.
Yeah.
And or like when we could, meet up with someone and record a group episode and be like, oh, let's sure. Or not only just to record, or for in the instance of like talking with Josh that once of like what saints are during the Thelemic holy days because we're going to talk about Thelema. So we've done the very thing that we're talking about, and reifies it through the whole thing of like, is this practical? Like, I really like this saint, or like, I don't care who we talk about, but we have to pick a saint for the day because that's our format, TM.
Yeah. And it brings to mind like, yeah, this sort of question or interest in comparing not just how we as Golgotha HQ, but how collective we think about working with better known and lesser known saints, right? Like this the wealth of lore that we get of a very popular saint and all the different things that have been done in different regions and how many different nations consider Saint George their guy, right? Versus like we don't know a lot about this other saint. Like it's kind of up for grabs. It's kind of more. I mean, the positive side of that is it gets to be a bit more exploratory, I suppose. Yeah,
which I think leads to like a hope of mine in our movement forward that we've talked about doing a corresponding membership section or something in time. But even the things that are interesting, I mean, like part of why this format works for me is because of the connections that come up during which I wouldn't necessarily put this with this saint or associate with it. And there's this vocabulary that's built through proximity, through luck, through design sometimes, because, oh, green, St. Patrick's Day or whatever the hell it is that we're talking about. But there is some design to the episodes, and some of them are also very random. And just we find out that this is actually interesting as we research that this is no longer random.
Yeah.
And I think there's something interesting to this of like we have talked about this idea of both praxis and invoke as being possible future headings for this show, maybe in a membership section or whatever. But the idea that praxis being actual workings with the plants and the stones of this style or the figures themselves or tarot cards, and then invoke of actually playing with the invocation of these saints, these demons, and these dead magicians as being part and parcel of our own how we think and work with these things. None of
Yeah.
this should be ironically, as for people that are very, very book friendly, both of us also exist in a world of relationality with these things, and this is nothing we talk about exists anymore as just words in an audio file or words on a page. Then I'm thinking about it in the research phase, during and after of like, how can I use this? What can be used in this way?
Yeah.
And I think that next step for us, wherever that goes, that I do want to consider both the pragmatic through praxis and the calling out through invoke or through invocation as a needed exploration, because I think one of the things that we've both been asked to talk about, and I think it is something that is both difficult and wonderful to talk about, is how to look at a historical exemplar and pull a working out of it when it is not specifically describing a working.
Yeah. Yeah. How to think in the craft logics of it, right?
Yes,
How
yes.
how to honor traditions of innovation within magic and spiritual veneration, and how to fold those historiola further into our lives and into the practical things we are doing and the goals we are attempting to achieve and sustain.
Which I
Yeah.
think is an interesting broad topic as on its own, and it's one thing that I love to continue to explore across the board. It brings to mind the notion of like why traditional witchcraft was called traditional witchcraft. It wasn't that
Mm,
there was one tradition, but that you were entering into a traditional way of speaking about witchcraft and keeping the otherness there and the lack of humanity there, and that perhaps you could propose, as many people have, that Wicca and the more neo-pagan versions of witchcraft that arose. Were in fact doing a form of traditional crafting, but it was viewed as that there was this guise that it was the only way, or that this is the true. The Murrayism entered in, which I don't think Murray is all bad. There was some wonderful things that came from, especially if you read her actual texts, and not always just what we say about her. But the idea that there was this great conspiracy of a witch cult that existed across Europe that was universal is just that's debunked.
right.
But there can be survivals of magical thinking across a great remnants of the Roman Empire or Greek influenced areas, or what is Goetia on a larger whole, or there's a spirit working from an Indo-European inherited context are all going to affect those things, or shamanistic tendencies and inheritances from a Finno-Ugric context. All those things are there, or this. It's kind of like British magic will always reference those giant sacred stones that have nothing to do with any living group that is still on the British. And yet it's
Right.
part of it because you grew up with it. I mean, if
Yeah.
that thing is just down the road, it's exactly like you said that Wales is not a Sephiroth.
Mm,
Like, you can go to these places and see them. Just because you don't know why they were built or how they were built doesn't mean it's not part of your psyche. For those of us that were Catholic by birth, and then perhaps by heretical choice as teenagers or otherwise, it's a similar thing. The saints are there. I want to work with them.
mm,
They're not going to be something I'm going to just dismiss when I know that there's inherent power there. You can sniff that power in the blood like any good witch. Which finger holds the power of the universe, right? Uh,
the witch finger.
yeah, which
Yeah.
witch?
Yeah, and indeed in speaking and in acting, thinking about traditional in how we might experiment or even innovate, it's a language that can better articulate, or better, that can potentially well articulate an engagement with that stuff. It doesn't mean that tradition or traditional has to be just literally what we do, or how we call the quarters or whatever. Mm.
I invoked the watchtower. Anyway, um, It always, but also traditional allows for us to understand at least from this lovely decontextualization or perhaps postmodern application of of my graduate training and undergrad training from a very postmodern university. But the idea that our popular literature and popular movies and popular songs are creating as much tradition as the quote unquote sacrosanct traditions that we hold up as like, but this is an ancient tradition. They say, yeah, and it was in as much influence as by popular things as it was the written things.
Yeah,
We know this. This context is there.
yeah.
Context is there. This
And that high culture feeds on low culture at least as much as low culture apes it or
yes.
corrupts it or streamlines it.
Yeah, what did you call me, you cunt text? This is an interesting thing, right? So if we're gonna mix, this is a lovely segue, perhaps, of like this high culture and low culture, quote unquote, relationality here and classism in this way, and like the idea that a peasant could be richer than some nobility.
Mm,
Like it's all fucking how you phrase things.
mm.
But demons and demonology.
Yeah,
And we
yeah,
have
yeah.
chosen almost always to put in saints and then demons in the way we speak about things. Rarely, if ever, have we ever jumped around to the others first. Saint, demon, and end it back with a dead person, which was the
Hmm.
that I love because it brings it back to invoke and this way, and to also understand perhaps the personhood of plant stones and even figures and cards in that way,
Yeah,
trumps. That is something more, and the agency that it provides us with, as well as the correspondences that exist within those normal things of normal lists of herb and stone that can now be applied to saint and demon and dead
mm,
magician, as well as what are the allies, what are the things that allow me to call upon those things and work with them in my life, or at least provide a medium or a call to something
yeah,
there. So high and low, we see this exemplified not only in saints but heavily in demon work.
right.
Uh, the grimoire expression being you must be literate, usually, and the in what language is a whole other sidetrack there that I just watched on that one Instagram account. I think it's Magic of the Grimoires, right? The where they showed a 12th and 13th century sigils of I want to say the moon, but what is my memory? Who knows? But it showed intact Arabic letters in the sigils that by later evidence
Mm,
of the same sigils, those Arabic letters had morphed. So it's
hmm.
quite interesting there that like that type of thing of like literate doesn't mean literate in the same thing that you needed to know. We know magical characters are often, I wouldn't say bastardizations, but certainly unknowing copies and modifications of Semitic languages,
Yeah,
and other languages that are in there.
yeah. Things
And
that we remember as powerful but don't remember exactly what they mean.
yes, names
Yeah.
of power that are now in an asemic relationship to it's asemic, right? I'm not crazy.
Hmm. Yeah,
Asemic
yeah,
writing. Yeah, it becomes a form of asemic writing that is in addition to our weird barbarous names of power and the phatic language of how we deal with deity invocation and intonation and all these things that are heavily codified and presented as ancient by the time we get to the Golden Dawn and then proliferated into the 20th and 21st centuries as these are the techniques of how things work when we don't actually fucking know a lot of it. Um,
right.
but it's at least 200 years old. Good for us. So demons and demonology, there is this idea that has been promoted many times that it is the popular conception of these demons that kind of get worked into the low class magic. In the same way that the pentacles no longer have to be etched on the right metal during the right planetary, just having the image is enough
Mm,
to have some effectiveness in your as a magical boon or ally or as materia magica themselves, broadening the like what is a text, let's broaden what is materia magica.
right.
My question, I guess, with demons and demonology as it goes is the study of these things there, that eternal specter of the King James saying or the understanding, right, that sorcerers retain their humanity and conjure devils and command devils, and that witches worship them. And I actually don't
Mm.
have a problem with this one bit. Like the whole witchcraft leaning of like, come to me in a form that is pleasing, so that we can have sex, demon, and then you can, I'll give you my my sex juices and my attention and maybe a little rare meat on the side. And you make sure that my cow's butter keeps flowing and
Right.
that my lilies are the best in the land. Um,
Hmm.
so I guess this relationship is already there in some way, but excusing this idea that witches are human or not human, because that's a whole other discussion, which we'll get into many thousand times over. Um, there's already a relationality here of the growing literary tradition, growing literalism, people who can read, there we go,
Hmm.
of the literati going into the lower and lower classes, that more and more people are exposed to how to read.
Mm.
Does that mean there's an automatic boom in people who can read grimoires and have access to them? What is this democratization of knowledge through writing?
Mm.
The transmission? How common are grimoires? And when a demon's popularity, let's say through popularity being tied to popular things, uh, through movies like Payman in Hereditary, or
Mm.
or Pazuzu in The Exorcist,
Hmm.
who's used as much as a controlling device against Lamassu and others. But anyway, that wasn't a really good question to spur you into demons and demonology, but I'm just going to be the little prod that says demons and class and where does it go? Somewhere in there. I'll Google.
Yeah.
I want.
Well, on the one hand, we absolutely have this idea to flip it round, that like demons are too important for poor people to be able to deal with, right? In this sense that proper, medieval necromantia is something that you have to have a lot of Latin and a lot of like 40 days of fasting, and the privilege to be able to retire from the world, to be able to speak down to them, to get them to do what you want, right? Let's be clear about that. Like, and I think what we're seeing with the democratization of magic across the early modern period is a lot of these streamlinings are partly about, yeah, occasionally are like, well, maybe we don't need to do 40 days. Maybe you don't need 12 servants to hold your various different magic swords. Maybe this new unused knife will do, right? There is some streamlining in terms of being something that like less wealthy or people with less wealthy patrons can now do. But there's also a sense that really interests me in looking at the like working books, these personal spell books, these compendia that demonstrate marginalia, personal recipes, as well as some reflection on those things, that there are applications of older techniques for more practical ends that aren't just about shaving off the difficult parts or the expensive parts, that are about taking what you have and taking it seriously and applying it elsewhere. We talked about this a little bit with like, I'm really fascinated by this notion of the conjuration of the spirit, or we could say the soul of a living person who's currently giving you jip or causing you problems. That in the bewitching works of maybe early modern British cunning folk, we have this idea of not just conjuring the imps that a malevolent worker has sent to sour your milk or possess your kids, but that you can summon their spirit itself while they sleep, while it wanders, and use the same medievalist techniques that you would use to bind demons to bind a person, and not just a magical practitioner, like a thief that's stolen from you, someone who has either slandering you or exposing the truths that you don't want them that you don't want in common knowledge around the pub. That taking the technology of conjuration and using it for other things beyond just a list of spirits in a book is so interesting to me, in terms of not just the democratization of the availability of texts and books, but what we do with that tech now, the repertoire
Yeah.
of it, as it were, once again. And that
Well,
what's more folk magic than working with what you have and seeing if
yeah.
it will apply to something else.
What's the relationship then between, because I'm curious the timeline of this shift, if we're talking about saints coming in and the demonization of the old, that this obviously the concept of daemon goes back further, and of course we're going to have this modern parlance where we say daemon instead of demon to mean this older archetype of messenger. But
Mm.
these messengers were also viewed not only as lesser gods within a Greek context, but abstract qualities like love or neglect or anxiety, like not
Mm.
necessarily anxiety, but that they had a certain quality of emotion or abstract aesthetic concept to them as well.
Mm.
And it's interesting because I'm curious the interplay. One of the things that we deal with, even in modern spirituality, you see the waves of people heavily anthropomorphizing deities, which we know is a very especially German and British inheritance in the way that we view the Greek gods, for instance. Um, the Romans did anthropomorphize them a little bit more, but also had an incredible concept of like pervasive animism that is
Yeah.
not present in the way the Greek myths or the Roman myths are retold. Especially when we go into like daily living of house deities and appeasing pantry gods and like just everything, every hinge has a deity behind it that can be appeased and related to, and the daemons themselves as messengers. I'm wondering, playing off of this concept of the saints being people so much that it emphasizes a personhood so much that there's no room for the things in the value centers that are like, what is love? What is the thing that brings love? That is not necessarily a deity, but like these messengers of love, the cherubs and the daughters of and sons of Venus that come in. I'm curious the what you're talking about is like it's like the pendulum swings the other way from going from an individual personality with a sigil to now being used to practicality in the daily life of like how does it increase your yield, how does it increase your fecundity, how does it increase your notoriety, which
Yeah.
again brings it back to abstract concepts in their pragmatic way. And so playing on a larger tradition of goetic values, I suppose, there of like the relationship between saint and demon and daemon is they're of course reliant on each other in this braided way that saint becomes that, but when it can't, the demon takes over and becomes
Mm.
that. But when it can't, they're still linked by this kind of umbilicus of daemonhood.
Yeah.
That was so pervasive and inspires many people, especially I would assume, I would posit Jake, in the many ways that he promoted these kind of pervasiveness of Western culture that relies on an orthopraxic rather than an orthodoxic approach.
Yeah. 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 This Damon Demon point is I think really interesting because as I don't want to claim that this is the definitive moment in the early modern period, the period I happen to have looked at the most. But it is fascinating looking at how, again, people who might be very literate in English and only semi-literate in Latin and Greek do start to how they copy out these texts, how they're transmitted, how they're received, how they're edited and altered, both consciously and unconsciously. We do see things like, I think it's in Gauntlet where he's copying out some section of the Heptameron where it mentions daemons or daemons or daimons, and he just translates it as good devil. So this idea again of like the practicality of this, to bang on that drum, but also that like the Reformation and its context of all your saints are now suspect anyway. Well, there's a sense of looking behind the person, looking to the personhood of a spirit to deal with these things, as much as there is a sense of like, well, we have to buy what we've been sold now. That's the Reformation doesn't. It tries to abolish purgatory, and we get more ghosts. It tries to ban exorcism, and we get more demonic possessions. Now, again, I'm sure good Catholics will be like, well, that's exactly what happens when you don't have exorcists lying around. But I think there's a bigger point, right? This
Not my priest told.
But this idea of the more thing is suppressed, the tighter the grip, the more systems will slip through your hands, is I think very present here. The other part of this that's interesting in terms of the idea of like of early modern Goetia and its connections to folk necromancy and to the practices of certain cunning folk who were working with maybe shadier or more unclean spirits, is that cunning isn't just what like allows you to work with devils effectively. I mean, it's one of the defining characteristics that kind of puts them in between this sense of like, well, they're not exactly worshipping them. They're definitely not like sabbatic witch, diabolist witches in that sense. But they also aren't necessarily doing all of the 40 days of fasting. They were down the pub the other day off their face, and yet they can still get these spirits to do what they want. They're probably giving them some kind of sacrifice and kind of producing this middle way between them. So yeah, it is a descriptive characteristic of a person who is cunning, that they have the means to get spirits to do what they need them to do sustainably, I would argue as well.
Mm-hmm.
But cunning is also what you get from working with spirits. The sense of like even and maybe even especially the unclean ones have things that they can teach you too. And this idea of the goetic offices over the liberal arts and over the mechanical arts and the values and the virtues of herbs and stones, I think is not just a clerical underground thing about being the smart drugs of their day and what you would do as the equivalent of a student, about to study your exams and cheating by calling a devil at midnight at the crossroads to give you the answers on the paper. Although that is really fascinating to me. It's also that people were treating them as tutelary shades of various sorts.
Yeah.
And we've got that from the experiments of Michael Scott with the haunted dream pillow that Brian translated out of the Necromancy of the Medici Library. That's at least 15th century. This sense that we don't just pin all our hopes on a devil, either naively or desperately, but that there is an understanding that they have cunning that they can impart and teach, as well as just being another means of constraining them. And this mix of pragmatism and of the pressures of class and of shifting political as well as religious ideas about what counts and what's magic and what's doable have these like really fascinating contexts and consequences for this sense of magic being more available than ever before by the 16th and 17th centuries.
What's beautiful about that is that despite the increase in literacy, you're talking about cunning. I love this whatever you call it when you have the skull break apart into thousands of little pieces and then go back on its little wheels thing, but like exploring and problematizing, I guess, cunning is wonderful because cunning becomes the lens through which you view everything. And I'm a big fan of those types of lenses. That cunning itself, if a demon tells you it can tell you the liberal arts, is it telling you that it will tell you the liberal arts you never had to go to school, or will it tell you how to perceive of things where you don't need the liberal arts education to interpret what an herb or a stone does?
Right.
When cunning becomes this as opposed to, and again, cunning doesn't need to sell itself except it's in its efficacy.
Yeah.
So the cunning becomes something different when you're taking unverified personal gnosis and trying to make it universal gnosis and saying like, well, the spirit told me that, but that's how fucking the grimoires work to begin with. Anyway, I think there's a really lovely thing of that, of understanding cunning as the shift from being wise in the ways of how things work to being wise into finding out the ways of how things work.
Yeah.
On a very pragmatic, practical level, which, again, yes, to all of that. Like, what is, if there, what brings to mind too is the early modern push through the various Christianities, especially because we're dealing primarily through a European lens here, of following the Roman inheritance of an in-depth, very complex animism grafted onto a state religion. You have everything is a devil until it's proven not. Is really what it comes down to, that everything is a demon until it's proven not. Because God created everything anyway, so everything is truly a daemon because it's linking you to God, but you're not sure if it's linking you to the God that fell, or that part of God being, if it's an omnipresent God, or at least following the follower that fell, or if it's this thing that can bridge something bigger, and what's the thing that decides something's good for us. That ultimate in Western heresy of like merging statehood and a theocracy, creating theocracy of like now the king and religion and the exploration of those things are one and the same, that there is something that is telling you what is good for you and how things are interpreted, and what makes a saint and what makes a devil, and curiously defends its own interest in doing so. Because again, this is going to be the episode where we talk about people we refer to all the time, Karen Armstrong, Fields of Blood, really interesting book, along with many of her other biographies of spiritual leaders. But she goes into that about how there's no word for priest in Mesopotamian religion, that it's just the people that eventually hoarded all the grain in that temple. They're nobilities, and they're noble for a reason because they're also collecting grain from people. And there's the interrelatedness of power structures and religion, where this concept of what we call religion in the West, especially for Americans, which is inherently distrustful of quote unquote other people's religions, never your own. But this problematizing of religion in that way is that I think that's the book where Karen Armstrong also points out that religion as an American concept is untranslatable into any other concept of religion. This
Yeah.
idea that your religion can separate you, this idea of separation of church and state, actually impossible. It's a lovely idea, but the values that are framing what the state is are still based in concepts of ethics and religion that we have mutually agreed upon in society, but there are going to be other cultural contexts where none of those things are going to be the same. And
Yeah.
you see it's explored in sci-fi heavily in like Star Trek and otherwise, right? Where it's like, "Oh, what's universal here? We don't fucking know because these people look at things very different."
Yeah.
And anyway, I think all that's fascinating within the concepts of um, everything is innocent until proven guilty. No, no, no. It's the complete opposite. Everything's proven saint. And
Yeah.
even then, that saint might be a Catholic saint and therefore be really bad.
Right.
Uh, yeah, so there's a lot there. I think I don't want to blow the wad out of exploring folk necromancy too much, but I until the later end. But this concept of what is folk, as especially in contrast to things like what is tradition, and the establishment of those things, because you have both folk at one time meant the unwritten tradition, but what was spread oral in a context of orality, which some of it might be written, but was heavily evidenced in the material culture, and in celebrations of what was more orthodox and more official celebrations of things, to now folklore being written down in the 17th and 18th centuries, whereby people are referring to that as the basis of other things. And we've talked about this before, but the term folkloric witchcraft comes out, or folk witchcraft, and then you go, what folk? Where are you getting this information from? Is it part of a contiguous communal context, or is it just from a book the same way that everything else is just renaming itself and going through these permutations? Who's folk? What folk? What makes it folk in this way? And what makes folk necromancy? What makes it folk and necromancy are both important. So I think you've hit upon the necromantic side of that, right? And especially just for anybody that it might be new to this conception and conflation of necromancy being that dead people do not exist in a conjuration lens through certain time periods of history through the Christian lens, and therefore that is demons that are populating their bodies. So necromancy is synonymous with demonology in a different way than we might now separate between demon and dead person.
Yeah.
And is important that idea of the black arts and necromancy and how all these things that go in, terms that can be both in vogue, out of vogue, heretically used, reappropriated, and misappropriated, all depending on what the authors and speakers' personal bias and agenda is.
Yeah. Demonology is itself like a scourge of categorization, right? Like the catalogs are, yes, can be treated in terms of like what counts and what doesn't. But that's again based off what that writer or that culture makes of a spirit, right? They're cartographies of cultural shadows and shades and bogeymen to a certain degree, right? But within those catalogs themselves of these grimoire texts, we don't just get that one counts, that one doesn't. We don't just even get hierarchy if this one is worse than the other one. We also get spirit interrelationalities, whether that's in talking about working groups of spirits or the weird discursive tangential long texts in, say, like the Goetia of Solomon, where it kind of goes off on a tangent for ages, like Paimons and things like that, to even like the collections of books of secrets, not just the Albertine, like bury this toad in a clay pot in your yard and you won't get struck by lightning, but the supernatural secrets are the spellcrafts of what to do with these spirits once you've conjured them. In Verum, in Rabid Madar, in the various grimoires that are attributed to Pope Honorius, this idea of like spirits knowing other spirits, and that there is value to understanding how the spirits themselves organize themselves. And there's also value in that, in helping us organize our practice. This is one of the features of why I think talking about working with the Four Kings gets to be important, not just as restoring redacted operative parts of early modern demonology, although that's fascinating in of itself, right? The way that we are reliant on people talking about things you shouldn't do to work out what we might do, but also like helps you orient literally your practice, the and the crossroads of your conjuration. Yeah. And then
I love the relationality that you're automatically speaking of between praxis and invoke. In our future newsletter terms of the bringing to mind your work with the excellent book and invoking, which I'm sure we'll talk about when we get there, but invoking dead magicians to tell you how to be a better magician and do more effective magic.
Yeah.
Similarly, the notion of certain people are told that they might attain rainbow body in this lifetime, and that within a Vajrayana sense, and that if you are told that you will attain this, that means you could probably start praying to your future rainbow bodied self in order to
Mm.
attain the rainbow body. And finding out, how do I make myself become the thing that I've said I'm supposed to be? How do I fill the big boy pants that I have put out for myself? Which is
Becoming the self-fulfilling prophet that will answer
yes,
your prayers. Yeah.
yes. So
Hmm.
helping the self-fulfilling prophet see. Puns.
Yeah.
Anyway, so I guess within this larger context of the generative demon, the generative
Mm.
daemonhood, is that really we are enlisting this also through our correspondences, through herb and stone, especially as allies into the work as minor spirits, as minor creations. Where are we? I guess the view can change there. Like, are these things of natural virtue enhancing of the work, or can they be convinced by pact, by demonic pact, by intermediary, or by virtue of exorcism and purification to be aligned with the work to help us further our goal? I guess is really the question. And those are very specific theories as to what is going on when you use an herb or a stone. Um,
That's a fascinating feature of like both folk and more formal grimoire work is I conjure the hazel rod, right? That you're not just conjuring the spirit out of hell or the angel out of heaven. You are, and not just conjuring the sword to have its own ancestral lineage of not being the sword of Solomon, but being of that lineage. But you're also literally conjuring very often the materia that you're using as well. And that in that case, it seems we definitely have this like crypto animism going on of some description, either
yeah.
practically or like literally conceptually. Yeah, I think that's a great question. Like, what are these things doing? When are they instantiations of something, right? And again, we're back to historiola and all the botanicals of Christ's blood, but also when are they doing an intermediary role for us and are actively involved in the process as well, like actually plant allies in the circle.
Well, what's interesting there is because if we're going to talk about form and performance, just realizing that's in there. Oh my God, my brain just exploded. But the world of forms and how this goes, that if you're conjuring something as the Sword of Solomon, and let's say you don't have said sword, or let alone the Sword of Solomon, this tool of articulation of naming things, which the damning and the Adamic way of doing things. Having Carol, if you're out there, I was 15 years old when she consecrated that red flare pen as like pen I named the Dragon's Blood. Um,
Mm.
of like, woo, that's some deep magic. That's some Aslan type shit right there. Um, like you just renamed this. Like it's Dragon's Blood Inc. now. Like
Mm.
it might not be the Dragon's Blood you're thinking of. It might not be the virtues that were conjured there, but the form of Dragon's Blood, the performance, that pen, to quote the not of
Mm.
performance theory, right? Of like the actor on stage is not Hamlet, but he's not Hamlet.
Mm.
There is a world where Hamlet is a form that is being worn by the actor, and that there is a meeting place between this, the mask and the mirror.
Mm.
That there is something here in the performance of something that is not dissonant means, but is also not literal. And
Yeah.
so this the frayed knot of the not, as I like to expand on those puns even more, and bring shame to my performance studies teachers. But there's something beautiful in this of saying, I am using what I have, and if I can afford better, it's kind of like, oh, if you're out there, sorry for betraying the trade secrets, but when I was a teenager, I was really interested in, because computers were still for nerds then. They weren't, that wasn't a common thing that everybody still did, learning how to type in my high school era. And so, wonderful class where we just played Civilization all the time. But
Sweet.
this idea that there was a friend of my coworker of my dad's who worked for Fox Studios and had all these access to like the Photoshop and the Premiere and all these expensive Adobe programs that were $1,000 at the time. And he may or may not have given me the key phrase, allegedly, of pirate it to start learning things, and if you make money off of it, buy it.
Hmm.
Like when you have access to it, buy
Right.
better, do better. But
Hmm.
like if it's that's what's prohibiting you, is like then get it. And I'm not promoting, and that's why I'm also not naming his name. I'm not saying I've ever encouraged that in people, but it's a
Hmm.
lovely ethic, and I think it's kind of what's coming down to us in magic here. Of like, yes, I would love to give you the copper disc inscribed with a diamond sigil, or a diamond tip stylus of to this demon, and give them permanent blood offerings once a week. But we're not there yet. Um,
Right.
how about I try and draw this on a brown paper bag with, pen I name thee dragon's blood, and we'll see what you can do for me. And
Hmm.
did it not win? Then there's always the out of, did this not work because I used, flare pen on brown paper, or did it not work because I didn't, because the demon didn't want to do the job? I don't know. This is where
Right.
divination comes in. This is where a lot of coven experiments in this kind of grandiose thing of like, learning alongside people was actually very helpful because it might have produced results for one person, and that's enough to go on.
Mm.
Um, but this idea of the form being something that we can assume that the mask, masque, of a total bodied thing can be the in itself attributing to the earlier discussion of Damon, that if
Mm.
love or revenge are daemons and the messengers of the gods, that emotions themselves and these archetypal forms that do possess us in many ways, and we can be overcome by our emotions. I like the idea that there's a relationship between that form in the performance, in the adopting of. This is the lineage that I am now a part of. I have adopted that, and that is added to the performance of magician in this circle. This is
Yeah.
the magical sword that I have adopted. This is pen I name the dragon's blood. This is I do not have this, but I do have this, and that is
Yeah.
not an excuse for me to say, oh, or in the words very much echoed in his courses. And I know he's not the inventor of this term, but Jason Miller is always a very big promoter of do not let perfect be the enemy of good.
Hmm.
That if you have 9 out of 10 things, you have 9 out of 10 things. Um,
Right.
like see if it will work, and in magic, it often does. Uh,
Right. It's not about cutting corners, but it is about like actually, like hopefully exploring, if not expanding, agency and efficacy.
yeah.
Yeah.
I guess the curiosity then with like Damon, that these lesser herbs and stones act as Damon in the oldest sense of like, can we animate their spirits? Are they conscious entities, which is part of whether you're an animist or not?
Mm.
Are they utilitarian in the very, Diablo-centric worldview of the early modern period of like, is this just that it's lesser and therefore I can command it, but it will aid me in doing these things because it does contain a natural virtue. And that
Hmm.
virtue could, of course, be polluted itself, which is, everything's demon until proven not, as we've just discussed. But the idea that bloodstone does have certain effects
Hmm.
upon the physic, upon the world around us, and ultimately could be a house for the ray that is part of an astrological election and cements itself in that because there is affinity, because it is what it was there, because there are 40,000 words for the word bloodstone and what that is as well.
Right. 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 Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. We see. Yeah. You get these confusions of nomenclature and description as definition. Rather like spirits, right? Names are often more what it does or even what it looks like. The thing's called fiery stone, the herb called grows in shade. Yeah, 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 yeah. And that we see these examples as already instantiating various like virtues, not just as properties within the thing, but as part of a process. Virtue as again a means to make things happen, right? That you get as a result this huge intertwining in lapidary and herbalism between magic and medicine, of course, but also that like plants and their growth are literally evidence, are the heralds and the promise fulfilled of the natural cycles of the year, of the engagement with the landscape, of the nature of magic and the magic of nature.
Yes, yes, and there's a lot here in the herbs and herbalism, and then stones and the lapidary, the divine lapidary, whatever we want to call this.
Mm.
There's something both overlapping and something not because we have the. It is easy to imagine a plant alive because it is alive by all our definitions. It is
Right.
much harder to imagine a stone alive, although we talk about a certain amount of phantasm or miasma that can be attached to something whereby which a stone might be purified to our use.
Mm.
And I love this idea of purification to our use, not necessarily meaning removing all impurities from it, but the idea that impurity or purity is about alliance with the work.
Yeah.
That it
Yeah,
is
yeah.
more about
Fit for purpose. Yeah.
yes, and that this is a very shamanic exploration, or it was often described in this way through like the chaos magics of the 80s and 90s and otherwise of like useful or not useful is what we're actually talking about.
Hmm.
That if there is a list of correspondences here whereby bloodstone stops blood flow, but also allows for this Aries type of energy to enter. I don't need the blood flow stopped when I'm invoking Aries necessarily
Yeah.
in this way. So you're literally by purifying, you're crossing out you're via negativaing a way of like the things that I believe we're actually talking about with purity is about purity of purpose and singular intent. Going towards this thing of like this is now this thing, and I have named it as such, and it's why you could use in the same way that those meme gags of like how do you say this in this language and how do you say this, and then it ends up being a sentence that has the same word repeated 40 times in different stress syllables.
Hmm.
But I think you could use Dandelion and Bloodstone for about 20 different magical operations with varying results in different categories if you know how to work with them and ally them and quote unquote purify them to your purpose.
Yeah, 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 yeah. This is a bunch of points that it's sparking for me. For a start, like that purifications and the exorcisms and the blessings of things often include telling speaking out loud to the materia and to your spirits what you want the materia to do. So
Yes.
they are an opportunity to restate goals, to have to vocalize what it is that you're trying to get them to do, as well as like if not programming them, then recruiting them. You are listing the vacancy of the job that you would like them to fill. Um,
Here's the
yeah,
mask. Will you wear it? Here's
right,
the script. Will you perform it?
right. The point towards like where we start to see the fruits of actually allying with spirits, actually knowing how to not just call them plant spirits or even mineral spirits, not just how to call them at all, but how to like get them to work specific and different things. I've been looking at how one of the criticisms of cunning folk in the British corpus is that they just use 3 herbs for everything. That like this must be evidence of either their fraudulent physic, because obviously we all know that it takes a million different things to cure a million different things, or that it's evidence that it's actually not the herbs doing it at all, but the devil. So again, it's this like, we don't like it, it doesn't work, and it's terribly dangerous. But what it's belying is the fact that, I mean, talked before about like Gauntlet has like 18 different love spells involving love, heavy scare quotes, lust spells with apples, but he also has a ton of stuff to do with vervain, which is again very like a mixture of very traditional older charms that are falling out of popularity with elite, more formal Solomonic grimoirists at the time, but also demonstrates like one of these is like how to talk to it. There's stuff in there about like how to marry the herb in various ways so that you have a relationship where you can then derive a bunch of other operations that you can do with it. So like
The operations are your little children through the marriage.
yeah. So again, like being able to get more things, more effects, more efficacy, more agency out of a deeper relationship is a feature, not a bug.
Yes. Yes. Yes to that.
Right.
I think the this notion of we again performance a call to perform, which is this sacrosanct thing in the actor's vocabulary that we call words to perform meaning when we read, right? This is part of it, that the active audience that is the reader is engaging and changing the material and reinterpreting it, and that part of what we're taking things back to is scaling it back to, if I'm going to spell out the sentence of my desire, that I need to make sure that these words are agreed upon by the players at hand.
Yeah.
And so if I want to take this, which is part of my fascination with this merging of performance studies and magic in that way, or at least a way to describe it, is you're directing, you're dramaturging it, and then you're directing it. Like, what do I want this to mean? That it should not be, and it's a discussion I've had with colleagues in the past, as far as magicians, of like 20 ingredients being animated by a lightning strike might produce a magical oil, but the same 20 ingredients will not produce the same magical oil every single time.
Mm.
It still must be engaged with and found out to be as what it is, which is part of where I'm exploring with VGS 2025 was just announced, but like I want to look at the immaterial parts of the magical oil, not just the material, because there's been this shift of increasing colonization through materialism that somehow people are acting like if we look under a microscope and through a pseudoscience, that someday we'll discover why this thing, and there must be a phytochemical reason why this
Right.
plant is associated with love. Certainly not a mythological or a color theory or anything like that. But
No,
like
let's do bioprospecting. Yeah.
yeah, and like explain everything away because also in our modern marketplace, this is what we can truly sell is the physical of something.
Right.
But this is not magic is not the physical. We're engaging in one realm to have an expression of vocabulary in the other, or perhaps even understanding that the division between the physical and the immaterial and the material is not there. That there is something that is, especially when we're starting to go into the ideas of forms of bloodstone itself is a thing that contains all the things of which bloodstone can be heaped upon it, but it also exists in its own native language that has nothing to do with our impositions, and that
Right.
is something different. And we're yes, there's form, the noose of the noose, as I like to talk about, but or pontificate while I'm on the toilet. I don't fucking know, but the idea here that bloodstone is being told this is what I need you to do here, the herb is this is what I need you to do here, and that part of the development of cunning is to understand that you must assign these things, that you must know that ultimately you can have trust that this traditional spell will work, but the spell is the form you are appealing to in that authority until you start appealing to what your desire is, what your tutelary spirits are saying of gather these things. You're putting trust. It's a borrowed authority and reputation to
Right.
come up with like, how to win friends and succeed in business, whatever the fuck it's called. But it's a borrowed authority through the reputation of tradition, quote unquote, the grimoire authority, or a spirit that has talked to you, that has relationship and knowledge with you, that you are talking to. And then eventually you start to understand the parts. There are times in many of our practices where we don't need to know the parts,
Yeah.
but we're relying upon that I trust this spirit or this person that told me to do this. There
Yeah.
are other times where we're trying to design something where we are relying upon the masks of each of those things to stitch them together. And also to understand that if the mask is about vitality, that is what I need to make sure that there are. I want as many things about vitality in this as possible that also overlap with very specific things I want to do, that must be the unifier of each of these things, and that I can have many things substitute for. Because again, correspondence and nomenclature and description does not mean that it only does one thing.
Right.
And the same way that this idea of plant allies is no different than saint allies to me. That one of the most beautiful things I ever heard a mentor talk to me about. Well, she was talking with a client because the client said, "What saint do I use for this?" And she's like, "The one that you work with daily. Start there. Like, just it's not dial a saint. It's not dial an herb.
Mm-hmm.
It's and even in pursuing, botanical, medical botany in that way, or Western herbalism, quote unquote, that if you have an action that you're looking for, herbalists might be familiar with extensive catalogs of herbs, hundreds, but most herbalists have 2 to 4 dozen plants that they work with on a consistent basis. And they're playing with what their knowledge and interactions between those plants that they know intimately are. In the same way that it is much easier to maintain a classroom of 12 to 30 children than it is to maintain a classroom of 500 to 1,000 children. You get
Right.
to
Because
know.
they're interacting with each other.
Yes, and that is the part that's there too, is that I love it when the science of it starts to get reflected in the folklore and which one was which, but there's this idea that in some northern traditions, belladonna and foxglove don't get along as plants. Well, they contraindicate each other medically action-wise, like stopping the
Mm-hmm.
heart or kind of restarting the heart in that way
Mm-hmm.
they antidote each other. But this idea that plants have their own relationships, profound, because it is no longer just an ingredient. It is no longer just canceling the action out. We can then understand the personhood of the plant. And I'm pushing the animist here because it rings to me true of the mask and the performer in this way. But how valuable it is to be told by the thing you're working with, like, I am not for you here.
Yeah.
Like in the same way that we talk about spirit contact, you can tell if a spirit has never said no to you, then something's off.
Yeah. 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 Emphatically. And that, like, being told no, or being told not now, or not at this time, or not in that way, gets to be a lesson as well, gets to be something that we learn from, gets to be a way to do it better next time, and to do it again and again and again. That, like, the craft of all of this gets to be refining and trying again and experimenting and trying to gain flow state and noticing when we've gained it and noticing when that noticing like brought us out of it. Like the no, like you said, it's profoundly powerful because it gets to trace an otherness that we can develop with and from, rather than just a fulfillment of what we thought we wanted when we started.
I'm curious. Well, I mean, because I like this idea of again, where are we going with this, and what's the quo vadis behind all of this of invoke and praxis, and the idea of using herb and stone as described through this genre as well, the interaction. Because one of the things that we enjoy doing on this show is braiding things together that should by our abominable braids, right? Like we should not be, and half of it's punny. Actually, I'd say all of it in ideal world would be punny or at least witty.
Yeah.
Because what is life without poetry? And the camaraderie that that brings, and the pure appreciation for like, oh, you bitch, you thought of that before me, which is it's a lovely friendship in that way. Like, I mean, come on, like that's fun. You know, I don't appreciate all of your puns all the time, Mr. Alexander, but I can appreciate the wit behind them. And that's come on, it's its own form of spellcraft there.
Oh, definitely. There was a short I watched of someone complaining that why did no one tell me that it was a D&D meme that was like, why did no one tell me that spell components are just bad jokes? And like
yes.
But that's true. Like the you know the components of, and that's games writers putting Easter eggs in, right? That like bat guano is necessary to cast fireball, right? As a prompt to gunpowder and stuff. But that's also how actual real world magic often operates as well. That like this herb sounds like that thing, or this herb rhymes with that thing, or this herb has some behavior that we want to mimic. Like talking about bloodstone, the other big one is heliotrope. Heliotrope is a description of an action, of an actor, of an agent, right? And the fact that it very often veers between whether we mean the stone heliotrope or the plant or the many plants that are called heliotrope is evidence again that it's the thing that's doing the thing. It's the sun turner, or the one that turns to the sun or with the sun. Punning is super crucial. It's a not just a vital wit of how did Dorothy Park put it, calisthenics with words. It's also how we don't just articulate but navigate a magical landscape and the power of like speech acts and of the conjure of both the immateria and the materia.
That ultimately, through our Western heritage, inherited religious expressions, you know, God speaks the world into creation.
Right.
We are mimicking this through our spellcraft, through our works, and certainly the value of speaking things out loud is there. The physical leading to the immaterial word is it invokes the form of the thing even higher than just being immaterially in the mind.
Two of the most popular early modern unbewitching ingredients: the Gospel of St. John, in which it is the word, right, and St. John's wort, chase devil, right?
Brilliant.
Like, and that is clearly because, and that's also because it of when it grows. Right, yes. The association with saint and herb having this like interrelationality and being used as a stand-in one for the other. And that
when it grows is highly important, right? Because when it grows also has the immature heads of the flower on there, which is the oil that we seek medicinally. But that means that you could squeeze the flower and notice that your enemies are bloody, that like you beheaded your enemies or their tongues in that way. Similarly, I heard a description. I was one of the Patreons I follow, and it was interesting because people were musing on Sekhmet specifically, and the tie to like Corleonis, Regulus, and this idea of, you know, this goddess that as she is listed correspondence wise is often of destruction and, you know, this overwhelming feminine power that destroys things, the guardian and the rage of Ra. But ultimately, because she's appealed to for health. And I remember people being confused by that. And I was like, but the sun is at noon. It's the sun at noon bearing down in all of its glory. This is the height of your health. And like that beautiful side of it, that when we start to shift our understandings of what something is the expression of, rather than the list of definitions behind it, once we can go from keywords to describe things of like, give me three keywords that are not normal, or at least that we don't see, like that challenge is important in that way of like, what are we actually looking at through this, and what are we losing by the over anthropomorphization of deities, specifically in this very Christian inheritance and saint inheritance way, where demons themselves lose their faculty as multifaceted beings and more like, well, I serve this thing and I go here. Our words themselves are legion, and this isn't just I loathe to propose a reality where everything is magical just because, or everything is magic just because it's magical. But I do love the idea of lenses of things. Performance is a lens through which I view the world. Cunning is a lens through which you can view the world. Viriditas is a lens through which you can view the world. Magic is a lens through which you can view the world.
Yeah, 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 yeah. Which kind of leads us, not that we need to stop dancing with the herbs and stones, but that does kind of lead us to thinking about the magic of magic.
Yes.
If that's useful, like as a term, the magic of genre, the magic of lens, as well as the magic of style and technique and classification. Right.
Yes.
On the one hand, we get this detailed or horizontal analysis of the whys by the whats. Right. The way we've looked at,
expand that. Expand horizontal analysis.
The way we've looked at, like, what can we do with sleep deprivation? How has it been considered? What do we do with it? The way we've looked, I think some of our genres of magic have been like scrying, right? That's a practice, but that's going to massively depend. It's, we get to do a bit of cross-cultural comparison and contrast, because like staring at a glimmering thing has a bunch of different techniques, but also can demonstrate different cultural and historical cosmovisions and lenses, right? Which then gets to be its own fascinating kind of exploration, right? And
in truth, like very much the impetus for even this show.
Yeah. It's got me thinking about like how real is magical genre, and how much is it a product of like compartmentalization as a reaction to relative excess of data, if not information, about magic these days. Like, when is it useful? Technique is one thing, but to start talking about styles of magic has to, if it's going to be useful, has to include the cosmology there, right?
Yes.
If it's not just a straight up marketing tactic, right? Or a compartmentalization in the sense of naming it so you don't have to deal with it. That's, low magic, or that's, too thelemic, or that's too witchcraft, or whatever. So I think, in getting to think about what are the lenses, as well as what are the techniques and how they inform one another, is super, super helpful, right? Always need to see the shared ways that humans deal with their issues and explore the spiritual, but also amazing and inspiring to see how varied approaches, how variable approaches can be, and the things that frame those techniques can be.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to our own evolution of where we went with this. Like sometimes it is a very simple, like, oh, here's a fun, quick thing: oil lamps or love magic. Well, love magic is really fucking broad, but oil lamps is a wonderfully specific. Dirt magic is still pretty specific. What is the idea behind household magic, possession as magic? Lunar mansions. These are all sometimes based on, of course, things that the saint or the demon inspires, or our guest at the time, or just something else. It's just like we have a list of things of like, we might as well keep going with this. But also in the past of looking at, I think it was on, or even the consideration on the Justina episode, that we didn't have a demon, and that, rosaries becomes a style of magic is its own thing.
Yeah.
But that Cyprian episode, we're going to talk grimoires and books and what that is.
Yeah.
All of which encompasses all the other ones too. It's kind of like, I don't, what is the spotlight shined on does not necessarily mean there's nothing else on stage. And there's a beautiful thing about this too, of like, I remember I really loved the episode we did this past January, which was Anthony the Great and Skirlin and Jake in there. But looking at the Grimorum Verum as a style of magic, is actually probably closer to a style of magic than we have ever hit on before because it
Mm,
defines itself in a certain way. And it
hmm
has context that we can explore and continue to talk about. But that one sticks out in my memory as something so wonderfully specific that it is perhaps more illuminating as to a genre or a technique. That the technique is the book it comes from, the classic, the things that are in there specifically is interesting to me.
Yeah, less about like these this protocols. Maybe protocol is fair if we're talking about like container and connector, but less a line reading of where its conjurations are different or the same as others, and more about the underlying ethos and approach of both the conjurer and the spirits contained in its catalog, right?
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
yeah. Like,
If you're going to go through like, okay, we have these different forms and functions of herbs and stones and even personalities of demon and saint and magician, but that genre is the style, right? So sonnet or freeform poem or shadow play or whatever these things are, that
yeah,
ultimately the limitation of those things does give us a certain freedom because we can specify and we need that condensation of the broad into the specific, the distillation there. But ultimately, it's fruitless if it's not within a magical worldview to begin with.
yeah.
And that those ideas of what magical worldview are also inherently different from person to person, day to day, minute to minute within our own lives. Those of us
Mm,
that practice multiple traditions, rightly or catastrophically, rightly, wrongly, or otherwise, we can speak of the need to keep everything as separate as possible, but also to understand that they will influence all of the way we think. To borrow
yeah.
the Cuban proverb of the dog or the cat has four legs but only walks one way, that you cannot be torn in multiple directions like being drawn and quartered by the things you study. Your head, your consciousness, your desire must be the thing that guides them.
Yeah.
That ultimately that cultivation of whether you want to call it will or força or desire, strength, blood, witch fire, all these different things come in for different names for what's being done. But the style of magic is like the funnel by which our ingredients get put into something effective.
Mm-hmm. That's a
Um,
really good way of putting it. Yeah, I like that. Yeah.
And I love this idea of everything being container of vessel. I mean it's like so to bring it to bring it back to the theatre. You hear my boyfriend yelling at me now. But so there's different ideas behind what is called the method, right? Stanislavski and going forward in that way. And one of the things that you come across in modern theater is that oftentimes there's this idea that the audience must receive the emotion that's on stage or being portrayed. And what was studied with that is that actually was not what happened. Like theater arose out of a mimicry, and was often viewed as like this over the top thing, right? Where the audience was always critically distant from what was happening on stage to a certain amount. You see a blurring of that by the time we get to things like opera and Wagner and this idea of hiding the orchestra and making things as glamorous and all these things happen. Or even within Greek theater where there's masks, but like violence doesn't happen on stage. It's referred to and like you might wheel something on in Revelation, but there's certain rules of, not allowing emotions to get too realistic. And it's curious that quote unquote the method and theater start changing heavily with the era of the camera and this capturing of realism on camera.
Uh, uh,
Like that we don't just refer to the cardboard cutout of the Eiffel Tower, like we can show you the Eiffel Tower. And
yeah.
part of that is descriptive of if you want real, or as the I think that's a Picasso quote, like if you want real, go to get a camera. Like I can paint real. We all learned how to do it. But it's not interesting anymore because there's photography has developed and film has developed. So in this same way, we expected theater. This, if you want to talk about high and low, just the differential references between film and theater and how they affect each other. And we expect actors to act real now. We want realism. What the fuck is real though? And if you're
Mm,
portraying real, do you have to torture yourself with a dead puppy in order to display that you are sad? Or can
mm,
you mimic the physical characteristics, which is where you get into with the kind of experimental theater, avant-garde ways of like create a container for the emotion. The words have their own meaning. And if you memorize the words, you can, yes, affect them, but ultimately you cannot fine-tune control what the audience is doing. You're trying to let the audience's projection of word, meaning, and otherwise, and all the context that they're seeing be projected upon the actor, and the actor becomes a container for meaning, not
mm,
necessarily the one that's feeling the same with the audience. And that's when you go crazy, right? If you're going to sit here and have the motivation to kill your husband every day on stage and that's what you have to get, well, you're going to go fucking crazy. And that's part
yeah.
of the for the theatrical world. But I appreciate the sanctity of the container, especially in this kind of Grotowskian inherited way that I think about things. But the same thing is true of magic. What is the container of my work? What is the genre that I'm working with? And yes, there could be a bake-off challenge of this. Of like, in the style of oil lamp, I want you to work with, I'll just keep on calling the same damn things, bloodstone and dandelion for a given aim. Go.
Yeah.
Here's your ingredients. Make me something good.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of where I think ultimately why we have fun with this show is the moving around of these ingredients to get new interesting revelations for ourselves, to change it through the perspectives of what we agree upon, what's new for us when we spark conversation, and what we might disagree on as well. Which is remarkably and sadly not as often as I would like. But because the disagreement is also really helpful for the world, as is new information and ways of doing things. And I'm sure we, disagree with our former selves more than we disagree with other people. At least the way I think.
Mm-hmm.
But I like this idea of container, which also leads me to the expansion of specifically applying that to geometric figures and tarot. Sorry.
Yes.
But geometric figures and tarot as container for something as different. And we've been moving this way in the show recently, decidedly talking about how we've done tarot twice. Like for the most part, we've hit most cards twice. And geometric figures, certainly. Some more than others, because it's more fun to talk about certain things. But the container, and I think that this borrows heavily from where we can get a lovely idea of this from the Odu of Ifa and Orisha tradition. There's the idea of Odu being a womb of possibility. And the figures themselves, I remember once talking with Sam, and I thought he said herm instead of figure, Sam Block. And I like the idea of it being a herm, in the idea of there's a head and there's that pillar and there's the little, genitalia sticking out, but like that each figure is showing a way for which you can go. That there's a crossroads here, and we are literally trying to figure out where can you just show me a direction here, any direction. How does this interact with the next one? And it is like going through a journey, especially if you're going through a traditional chart, right? If you have your four mothers and it progresses down there to a final amphitheater of the court. And it's like this journey that I love this idea of. We do have multiple possibilities still, but through the communication of one figure with another and the interrelationality of those things, much in the way that we might craft a spell, we get to an articulation of a point that is more specific and narrowed down that can be practical.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I had a really good time teaching doing the presentation for Astromagia this year on Crossroads of Earth and Stars. And thinking about like what are figures, and was definitely it was really helpful to draw on the kind of, like you said, the discussion and the ways that we've been going, and not just reeling off delineations or correspondences of the figures that we look at each episode, but like thinking geomantically about the world with them, and crucially like acting in that world. And definitely this, love this thing about like herms, and that they're crossroads, that they're both muster points of patterns and spirits of possibility, get to be menus for operative sorcery, but also haunted doorways, like beacons and access points for spirits and their influences, as well as, and inspired by the fact that they're also archives of befallen fate. They're themselves collections of historioli, and of precedents. Right.
And if we're going to use container as a thing there, then you have Karka right there, a woman tomb. Of like, that is the container around something. The magic circle is like everything that's happened under this name is applicable.
Yeah. And both the great protection that can provide, the focus, the hermetically sealed vessel, and also the measurements and warnings about what goes wrong in pressure, in restriction. That's been something I've been thinking a lot more about in terms of how these can help us, how this appreciation of the containers of figures and of a shield and of our practices themselves can help us navigate, right? How we can engage beneficially with a pattern, the idea of finding something useful to do with its potentially amoral energy and influence, using Cowder for curse breaking, using Karka to impose more like self-discipline and stuff. But it's also interesting where getting behind the wheel of a thing rather than getting hit by the car of it is also about acknowledging what not to do, or
Yeah,
as well as what to do, right?
I like this
It's
metaphor. I've not heard that before. That's brilliant.
yeah, like what like it's definitely helpful when especially when like a client has a little bit of geomancy under their belt and we get one of the scary figures and talking about, okay, what can we do with this then?
Yes.
There's a wonderful self-fulfilling thing about how you can often read something about where the client is currently at from the first figure that falls, from the one that marks the querent. That's not necessarily their whole life or what they're like born to do or their destiny, but it tells certain things that might be relevant. Sometimes they're very relevant for the divine. I've talked a bunch, I think, about how omissio in the first often means that the client has forgotten to tell you something important. I've observed that like Tristitia falling in the first means that the client, either consciously or unconsciously, is likely going to gravitate towards the things to be sad about. It doesn't necessarily mean they are depressed, but it does mean that you need to frame it slightly differently.
I think they may be depressing.
Yeah. Well, often these things are warnings for the diviner more than for the client, right?
Yes.
There's particular configurations, not just like what falls in the first, but what falls in the first and the 10th and where the witnesses go that can tell you this client is outright lying to you, not just like forgotten to say something, but is tricking you, is telling you to ask about their dead mom and their mom is not dead. Like is active deceit going on. Those are the feedback loops for the diviner themselves.
Yeah, you see some obviously parallels of that in Odu as well, of this understanding that the reading that is being done is the deity speaking, usually Eshu or Elegua, and or through Ifa, whatever the confines that we're talking about here, but that the deity is speaking to the diviner on behalf of the client. The deity is not just speaking to the client. And there is a thing there where if it is, since you are the one that is now in relation to the spirit that is being invoked, to the deity, to the Orisha, because again, those words are all translations and it's a weird thing, that deity has a relationship with you. The Orisha has a relationship with you. This client is coming, they're the outsider. And so that you want a healthy warning here. And the development of those skills is as important to the magician as to not only solve the client's issues, but because there are many ways to consider that, specifically when the cosmology of Orisha, we're going to talk about that everybody that's an initiate also understands that there are certain Odu, certain readings, figures that are upon them permanently and how they interact with the world. And if you have certain Odu upon you, that client may have contraindicatory Odu. That means this person thinks completely different than you, which you might be warned then to say, this is not the way to phrase this to this client.
Yeah.
Like we can look at this and go, with these signs that are falling, this person needs compliment, critique. Whereas somebody else, you can be like, this person can take anything. Okay, here's the problem. Let's go. And that is important too, that this is not just out of context of a direction of how to solve the problem of the client. It is also giving a map in how to interact in relationality. And again, hitting upon that same thing that I talked about before, that knowledge as relationality that's the true decolonization of knowledge, right? It is not a commodity. It's not something that the hidden book, and this is where we get magic still exists in this worldview, that if I get the right grimoire, I'll have the secrets of everything. After a certain point, one grimoire is as good as the next. And like certain ones that are there, and that's not necessarily true, but on this broad level that I'm trying to argue right here from my current point, is just that if you take anything to extremes, you can learn from it. If you take anything into full practice, it will expand past the container of its bindings, and you will learn more from it. But that does not mean that there is one book out there that will put everything together for you. There might be one book out there, it's true, that like opens insight into things in the sense that like there's a root guru and there's many gurus, that you first understand the nature of reality through one person. Does that mean that was the person that did it for you, or were you in the right place, the right time, with the right context and history that both of you collide? Similarly, I think when reading here, it's interesting to understand the figures and the way that they're drawn as interacting with each other, and you get two different access points, at least through Odu when it's used with Orisha, where you have these Ifa Odu that mirror exactly homoformically, homoformic, I think is what we said, even though that's not a real word, it is now, of like, 2212, being a
Mm.
certain Odu by name and a certain figure by geomancy. And they have some similarities and some differences which have arisen through cultural contextualization and practice. And oftentimes, more often than not, an extreme, you can almost see what the root was. It almost feels like going back in time. I understand the linguistic impulse to be like, this is the proto root of this figure, and it expanded into these different cultural contextualized meanings
Yeah.
across time. But there's also this lovely thing where these figures interact with each other. And in the mythology of Odu, they're born from each other, some of them. Some of them are born from heaven directly, some of them are born from other Odu interacting. But because of this binary system of 2 and 1, that you have on and off, that you have these 16 figures generated across 4 distinct points, which either gets, head, throat, stomach, foot, or some permutation of anatomy, or the weight of the elements being, fire, air, water, earth, based in density, or some permutation thereof, which means that the head is either on or off, the throat is either on or off, the stomach is either on or off, the feet are either on or off, and that there's this filtering of light through this prismatic form of the figure, so that that reality or light in this living light way is being filtered through the interaction through the shape of the figure in some way, which is all used mnemonically to be able to contain this knowledge, right? Like ultimately, do I think that the light is filtering down in this way, in the same way that there's this Kabbalistic maxim that like if you look at things closely enough, you'll see the Hebrew words that things are made of. Is that literal? For me, no.
Right.
But it is still a beautiful way to think of like this prism and filter of things in the same way that if the genre is the filter of our work, that the geometric form is itself providing a clue to how things interact. And some people place more emphasis on elemental ascription and of on, off, or not. I do think that there's something really interesting when you see geomancy being used across the board now in a very strong revival in the West. That is, the Golden Dawn seeds are there, right? Like it's almost forgotten by that point and expands. And it has taken 150 years of it being reiterated constantly. And then by the 90s and 2000s, again, it starts to expand hugely and perhaps from contact with other traditions that use it similarly, like Ifa or Ramal or Islamic geomancy that is so different in Afghanistan than it is in Morocco, than it is in Southeast Asia or South Africa. And it's also those differences that mean that it is a living tradition. It is a viable tradition. Those often in the West are built upon the radical monotheism whereby we think that there's one way to do things. And as opposed to, or perhaps that's an unradical monotheism. But the idea that it is the differences are what make it beautiful. The coherence in the system that you practice of geomancy is built upon through personal sweat and toil of trying to figure out what works for you through a combination of study and exemplified in the readings you give your clients and in the magical workings you do of how to make sense of this body of text. Does that mean that your student, I would hope that in anything I teach, that a student will take what I have, my trials, my tribulations, my best of, what I'm terrible at, and figure out how that works for them, and then add their thing on it in the same way that is talked about, like within Vodun, that there's 2 reglements, right? There's the reglement of the house, and there's your reglement, in the same way that private and public practices behind things. The way that we talk to our partner in public is not the way we talk to them in private, usually. And that's not about dualistic. It's not about having 2 characters. You can have the same character and poise as a person, but you understand that there are different contexts for which to speak and to interact. And I think the figures are so expansive in that way that they give us a comprehension that has blown past what it was proposed for, because I don't think the Golden Dawn understood what they had. Because it had been gone from the Western consciousness enough that it was remnants of quote unquote fortune telling, which is always looked down upon in that early kind of ceremonial magic, as opposed to the practical guiding of how you think, why you dress a certain way, the understanding that appearances do matter, not just on a purely gut level, but that if you're going for an interview or you're going to court, dressing appropriately will make it better on your side. That doesn't mean it's right. It just means that it is an advantage that you can participate in or deny, but or choose not to harness. But to deny its efficacy or power is plain stupid.
Right.
And I think the figures are beautiful in this way. And I do think that the divination that has come out of kind of this hippie revival is beautiful because tarot has expanded hugely. There's this idea that tarot is read the same way over the centuries. It has not been. There's those set meanings are not there. Geomancy probably has more set meanings because of the cultural context of things of yes, certain herbs or deities or myths or things being contained in loss and gain and these broad cultural concepts, which you could argue then are demons of themselves, demons in the classical sense, and that tarot is, originally a game and it's about trumps and these broad cultural contexts, but it is much more interesting to think of the moon as something more than just the body in the sky.
Mm,
That how do I perform moon in my life right now?
yeah,
Similarly
yeah,
to how Jay has proposed lunar mansions as being the procession of the night theater. Like that, these are things that you can see. There are players on the stage of the sky right now that are interacting. Or Jen used to talk about that in her astrology foundations course, her astrology AF course, where it's like you're sitting at a table and to understand who you would keep near from you and who would you keep opposite you and what sides starts to give insight into trine and sextile and things like this of like we're dealing with Mesopotamian feng shui of angles and where things are, and it
yeah.
starts to make a grander sense than my babbling. But yes, to geometric figures, I often bow out because if I bring in Odu stuff, but uh it's also where I'll blow smoke up your ass, Alan. Like I commend the work that you're doing and the sheer tenacity of really just your knowledge of geomancy is inspiring. So thank you for letting me be a fly on the wall in those explorations. But I don't think I think it's very identifiable who the movers and shakers are in the geometric revival, and we could name probably 10 people that have really pushed things forward. And I just, as your friend and co-host, just want to make sure that for me, you are always on that top list of people that are doing things that I don't think people even have an understanding of how much your work influences how they view about geomancy.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it's a funny thing to look up from, what you're doing and find more people to talk to about it. Like that's really been the joy of it for me. Like you said, I love the idiosyncrasies of geomancers, right? In thinking about alternative correspondence systems, right? And like
Yeah.
how appreciation of those gets to enhance our understanding and the efficacy of our engagement with the focus and with the figures. Like it's obviously important. This feels like the thing about the dog with four legs going one way as well. Like that, like
Yeah.
if you like that it is really useful to both understand, okay, before I throw sticks or however you generate your figures, I'm gonna use this particular, if this figure crops up, I'm going to read it as a fiery figure. But in my exploration of the figure itself and its mysteries and its markers of potential and its shelf mark of reality and its effective elemental alloys, I'm also interested in what other people have said about it, how I might understand it differently. And that difference gives a strength and a polyvalence to things that doesn't have to mean confusing you or having arguments about which system is better. And I think there's something really beautiful about that, making that more present and more understandable in how we learn divination, how we teach divination, how we speak about divination, and how we perform divination, and the sorceries and the spellcrafts and the spirit works that it can help us navigate through. Taking it seriously and taking other people doing it seriously as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have never. I think it's part of the immaturity, and I don't mean this in the, well, I guess I mean it in that way, but the lack of time that has passed with geomancy being prominent again in the West, that I see a lot of arguments. I don't see Moroccan geomancers hashing it out with, Madagascar geomancers the same way. It's like you
No.
have your system and you know how to read. There is a pride in how you do it, and there's also this sense that like now there's schools of Western geomancy, in the same way that I think there's prominent things. I have learned more from being present at a table with you and Sam and others talking about geomancy and disagreeing than in a polite way of like, okay, get another beer. Like it's as I mentioned on the Jake episode, and it's just he's heavy in my mind because there's a lot of people talking about him right now, and it's very interesting how that goes. But like Jake never met a disagreement he wouldn't buy a beer for. And like let's fucking talk. And like that's this like if Jake the folk saint is around, like invoke him for that. Like,
Hmm.
and the ability to talk over your differences and be like, you don't agree with me and you think I'm shit? Let's talk. Like, let's hear
Hmm.
it. And
Hmm.
to go home and not, and to be inspired by that, like, fuck yeah. Like, that's a superpower.
Yeah.
So I guess the difference is, I guess, the lack of age is showing in geomancy sometimes, and a lot of the Western occult quote unquote revival, right?
Mm.
A lot of these things are also because they're being exposed to traditions that aren't in a revival, that are inherently just still going, whether it's or under a new permutation, whether it's Afrodiasporic or better and better record of Greek tradition or certain specificities within different European traditions, giving value to Eastern European and Orthodox saint magic on par with, fin de siècle weird satanic French saint magic. Um,
Right.
and what that means, or what it means to be a British saint, that no one knows why this well is named for this saint, and we only know that the saint existed and there's a grave, but we don't know anything about it, but somehow
Mm.
there's a whole festival around them.
Yeah.
And all of those things are there. That's the folk part of all of this, is we are folking everything.
Hmm.
We are mother folkers. That's going to be quoted in the wrong way. But yeah, so I guess the side of it too, because one of the things that comes up with tarot is this concept of fate and what that means with divination, because we did include both a tarot trump and a geometric figure. So we are dealing with heavily, we're both diviners. We like divining.
Mm.
And it's funny because neither of us use tarot as our primary means of reading, but we are both familiar with tarot. And it's kind of a universal Western language. And I don't particularly want to get rid of it on the show. I think geometric figures are easier to bring in as they're brought, as they remind you of something that, oh, this person is actually a really good embodiment in this frozen in time exemplar of Pur.
Yeah.
Or, the lightsaber, as you pointed out, being via is both obvious and really lovely as well. Um, or here's the sword that was used to kill that your dad used to kill a bunch of younglings, was
Yeah.
fantastic.
Not the younglings. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what does that mean for Via? Oh, Via is viewed in a good way, but not always.
Yeah.
It is just a
That
path.
that
Um,
that universality, that language of tarot is really fascinating, and I think there's really something to that. I was thinking and writing about how folk magicians are sometimes more likely to be called fraudulent, especially by each other, and also by, like, more formal ceremonial magicians, that they're not doing it properly, and that they're just faking it in some way, that they're using the pretense of having a big book of Agrippa, or a spooky looking dagger, or something like that. And I was kind of trying to navigate how to query the difference between when are, I mean, again, for the examples I'm looking at, when are, like, early modern cunning folk using astrological language as a lingua franca to be able to explain things to their clients, and when are they literally just, like, faking it at all, right? There's plenty of examples of people being like talking, talking planetarily, for instance, in the record, and then when someone asks them, like, but how do you do this? Like, I'll be honest with you, I go to my spirit for it, but I frame it like that for my clients because that's a way we can understand things. And I think there's really something of being able to both engage with the depths of your own idiosyncratic practice, and also be able to usefully build the bridges to administer the medicine of your divination and your client work in a language and a framing that can be understood and engaged with, that you don't have to show all your working, but you do have to find a way to meet halfway at some point. And I think tarot
mm,
has some optionality in that, in terms of framing things in a way that has a broader cultural literacy, right?
mhm.
The way you've got the diviner witch on Agatha all along, just randomly saying names of cards about things, about people, about
Oh,
situations, right? And there's clearly some stuff about her bouncing back and forward in time that I hope we're going to see later in the series. Hopefully that won't bite me in the ass when this comes out later. But yeah, that we can talk about, oh, oops, all towers, right? And there is a sense of being able to frame, if not the container, then at least the space that we can then craft the container.
yeah, I think it's funny you bring up there's this amazing book by quote unquote anonymous, The Meditations on the Tarot, A Journey into Christian Hermeticism,
Mm.
that is thick as fuck. It's like six, close to 700 pages, I think. Um, but it like there's an afterword by a cardinal. Like it's interesting to see how this goes. Of
Hmm.
using the 22 major arcana, it's just to explore spiritual questions. And it's one of my favorite books on tarot because I love the co-opting of tarot as a language there. Like, give it to me. Like that kind of in-depth exploration of every card with what it means as is through a Christian lens
Hmm.
is fascinating. I think is an excellent book for any magician to look at because you can easily understand how to then go in depth with your specific traditions and cosmology.
Hmm.
And the tarot being built upon a Judeo-Christian mindset. And it's interesting because even the term Judeo-Christian, what the fuck does that mean? It's
Right.
Christianity aping the authority of Judaism within its own scripture. So
Hmm.
it's really a Christian mindset we're talking about. But the one of the things that you have brought up before is like the isolation of a card from its contextual, whether it's a formulaic spread, which complex spreads are far more modern, and I find it very interesting. Like, how do the cards know that's the spread? I'm very confused.
Yeah, when do
But
we lose
or
sight of the joined up bigger picture?
yeah, like whether it's a line of three or five,
Hmm.
or doing a Lenormand type of
Yeah, the way you
rationale.
talked about Lenormand as like they're component words of a sentence of the
Yes.
of the thing that you are speaking of
And
the
specifically,
advice.
it's because Ali, you had brought up like, oh, do we want to do a Lenormand card? And I was like, here's the thing: is that they don't really do well on their own. Like, I can tell you the nouns, verbs, and adjectives, but like classically, whether you're French or the German school, it has to have context. And part
Yeah.
of that is like if it's based upon like coffee or tea leaf symbols or like the way that they're talking about. There's many origins that are talked about, but like everything is a relationality to like where it is on the clock of the cup. Correspondence to the handle, but when we get to Lenormand, that I was taught to read like a grid of nine as if it was part of a grand tableau. That like
Mm.
even a line of five, that if you needed to expand it, you could. And I like that way. I also really love that open reading, as it's been called, has been hugely brought back or expanded or mythologized in the recent years of like, I don't know if that's the original way things were read. It does seem to be the way things were read. If you look into like Baraja Española and the ways that a lot of Latin American card readers read until the pamphlets of the 60s moving forward, but the idea that like cards just influence each other. Like, and if
Mm.
you want more query, if you have more need of going for it, you throw more cards on that card, touching it,
Yeah.
letting it expand. That it is really a guide for the head to like, the kind of variation way of there's the basket, and you're just kind of throwing into the layer of like card after card after card, speaking your truth as it goes. Instead of very formulaic things, which is very what we associate with like the little white book of here's this definition, and you need that. But also, I remember my dad
It's
talking about tarot as a child of just like going to a party once and doing it, and people kept coming to him for readings when he didn't know how to read. He was just having fun making stories up. And he used that as a way of saying, look how fake it is. And I use that as a teenager to be like, look at how dramatically universal it is.
yeah, yeah, yeah. That's yeah, that's a skill.
Yeah.
You can have fun making up stories, but also being able to weave narrative, right?
In
Is
in in Portuguese, to divine is still used with jogo, game.
yeah,
It's a game of destiny. You're still playing the divination. You're still
play
playing,
shells. Yeah.
yeah, this idea of how to jogo de búzio, you're playing. It's an engagement in that
Hmm.
way.
Yeah.
Um,
Huh. Every like shit hot tarot reader I know, when you're like, oh, or we were thinking about this card on the episode the other day, will be like, oh yeah, yeah, yeah. I guess it can. I mean, it could mean that in these contexts, and then we'll automatically start like not automatically, but like we'll expand on like the keywords or the like the even the very specific meanings to what it's doing in the rest of the reading and where it came up and in reaction to what and what sort of query, right?
yeah,
Again, I talk a lot about how geomancy kind of requires a very specific question, but so you can tell whether or not Amicio is losing the illness or losing more of your health. But that's
yeah,
kind of true of like a specificity of question is something that's more important more widely, especially in cartomancies where you might also be telling the client a bunch of stuff that they didn't know they needed to know.
yeah. I think it's fascinating with this too, in that again, geomancy and tarot as a form, as a container of many things. I see the early comparison of like Cathal Ramalan Islamic geomancy, where there's the traditional like close to 100, usually 99 questions also associate with the name of God for each one type of thing, where you could divine names with geomancy. And people
Mm.
would say, well, like, well, that's lost in Western geomancy. It was like, well, when you convert it to from Arabic to Latin, that might be the problem right there. But that one of my first teachers, who I adore, who's the same woman I told you that had it was the one that used rainwater and sand and specific woods to do the dots for geomancy.
Oh, hell yeah.
That was her thing of wetting fulgurized rainwater specifically, so rainwater that falls during lightning storms, collecting in a non-metal device, either distilling that just because it gets funky, or just pure, using small amounts of that and wetting sand with just the right amount to then choose a stick if it's, in that kind of Golden Dawn inherited way that was still very popular in the 80s and early 90s for geomancy of like.
Squilling. Yeah.
Yes, that you needed to have, for instance, Venus, if it was a Venusian question, you would call upon the Olympic spirit and then grab the myrtle stick, which had been imbued with Venusian things, and that you could burn Venusian incense to ask this question. But that the sand itself, the container of this, you could ask more Venusian questions while it was still wet, but you had to wait for it to dry in order to ask a different planet.
Mm.
And that and she had several boxes of this, but ultimately you could expand this to be like, hey, I want 7 of them. But
Mm-hmm.
this work with the Olympic spirits in this way is a very specific take on it. I think there's other ways to work with it. Obviously, it works out of context within Islamic geomancy, where it's all relevant to Islam as a container, or to in West African geomancy, specifically Ifa, where you're going to work with the Orisha and Orunmila in this way. So I think that site is interesting. What's fascinating there is that what she did was she found a way to read with tarot cards of like divining names, and she was really good at it. She could give you a name, and is that to her providence, I don't know, to her divinerness, awesomeness? Yes, but rather than bemoan that this system doesn't have it, is like, can I figure out how to do that in the system that I am good at?
Yeah.
Is the question. And like she passed when I was still a teenager, and she's a shade I talked to a lot, but also I never got to ask her that question. I didn't think, my teenage brain didn't think to ask that type of question yet of like, was this because you saw it in other systems, or was it just something one day was it a technique you were taught, or was it something you developed? Because she was the type of person who, if she wanted something, she would figure out how to get it with what she had.
Yeah.
And that was the thing of like, if I want to be a better reader, I want to learn to use names. How do I do it? What techniques are out there already? What can I do? Can I create something? Can I dream something? Can this demon tell me? Can this saint tell me? I don't fucking know. But
Right.
the proof is that I don't know if she could teach that, how to divine names to other people, or was it something that came up through the tool of tarot? Because we talk about that with cartomancy. I think one of the big dramatic differences is that to read geomancy, you're reading geomancy, and you are at least relying on your knowledge of the figures first and foremost, and then through the expanded chart systems of their positionalities in the chart and the court, or through the houses. And that's how it's become popular in the West, but you can develop other ways. But the tarot has a much more divergent way of expertising with them. And it is much more common with cartomancy, in my opinion. Maybe this happens geomancy too. I do think that once you are a diviner, you can learn how to divine with almost anything. It might take you years to master the cultural context of something, but diviners divine. That's part of it. And there's an understanding even within Odu and other systems of like, some heads are better at divining. It is just true. It doesn't mean they're good at following through or have their personal lives in shape. It just means they're good. Like, I want to be clear. There's certain things that people have propensities for. Does not mean they're trained as well, and they still have to do something with it. Propensity does not mean that you are a master.
Right.
But certain heads are predestined towards certain things in certain ways, just by the nature of how they are, or their traumas, or whatever it is. That said, tarot has a different way whereby you can read the cards themselves based upon the supposed meanings that we have put onto them. You can read the cards based upon what comes to you, or you can use the cards to fall into trance and then literally prophesy based on whatever you're seeing. You could also use the cards to invoke a spirit that will then whisper in your ear. This is how they interpret the cards.
Yeah.
And that happens a lot in Baraja Española and like Caribbean ways of like, oh no, you're not really reading cards, you're just kind of throwing cards. It's like, there are people that read cards. And when you read just the definition, it is far less exhausting because you're just reading the definitions. You're doing the work. And like this is the thing within Lenormand, where they'll say there's no such thing as interpretation in Lenormand. Like it's a vocabulary, you learn it. It should not be exhausting. It should be, yes, here's no, the man's not interested in you. You have a job coming. You just kind of spout and make sentences of things. But it's not no intuition. There's interpretation, but no intuition.
You're running through the catalog of it. Again, the kind of shelf marks of reality. And like you said, that's not necessarily less magic than falling into exhausting trance and exorcist head spins and eyes rolling back and spouting the end of days.
Yeah.
Or the incredible specificity of this spirit that comes through you for that stuff. Like there's downsides to both of those things, right? Like you
Yeah.
said, like the trance stuff can be exhausting. And if you've got, one
But not as
client,
exhausting as half trance, let me tell you.
right.
But we have talked
When
about
you're still there,
diviner's
yeah.
trance is a thing. To
Yeah.
understand like possession and this ways of studying that I love to, we have to talk about how diviner's trance is a thing. That if you can divine accurately, there is I don't know anybody that doesn't agree with this in the sense of like maybe there could still be, I prove me wrong. But when we talk with other diviners in any system, there is a point where you can see that they click into something. And their periphery is different. They're not hard focusing as much, and they kind of go into things. You can code switch and go into conversation again with the client, but you're still trying to stay in this accessible place where there's a dialogue and a relationality of your tools with you and the spirits or whatever it is that you do. But that trance is a mild form of possession, period. And it is something that is recognizable, and it is something that we do. Now, what's possessing you? That's a good question. And that's going to change based on cosmology, because some people say it's just you opening up to the spirit, to the spiritus mundi. Some people are going to say no, that's you, a higher part of you that is accessing your spirits. Some people are going to say that the cards themselves are a form of possessory knowledge because they possess knowledge, and that they can similarly possess you, or that you are the fool. I had one teacher at a workshop even talk about that. Like it's actually the fool that possesses. It's the fool's journey. So, like, there's the diviner with the empty bag and there's the diviner with the full bag. Which one do you want to be? So take it seriously and study. Which a lovely slap on the ass as it is.
Your exploration when we did the diviners on divining about like differences in divinations and approaches feels quite relevant to that sense of like what's the cosmology going on about, like it's kind of who you're talking to, but it's also like the manner in which you are deriving this stuff more broadly. Like you kind of outlined these three, if I'm remembering this right, the idea of something as like actual sacred message, right, from deity, from orisha, from what have you. Then right at the other end of the spectrum is a lot of like more secular, it's psychological exploration, and then somewhere in the middle there's things. I think you place geomancy there as like it's measuring things, which means that it's both influence. It means that sometimes the measuring is acknowledges that this isn't the best time to measure. Like we've talked a bunch about how various geomancers traditionally wouldn't do it in storms and things like that. That there is something quote objective here in this measuring of stuff, but also that it's not entirely. This is the only word of God or the gods. And that feels relevant to bring up here about like not just who are you talking to, but like how are you meant to be taking it?
Yeah. And again, I think all of these things are, it's setting a table. And I love that metaphor for many reasons, or to borrow the Gurdjieffian, right? Like this metaphor on metaphor on metaphor. But the Gurdjieffian famous metaphor is the coach, the driver, and the horse. And that there are different oral interpretations of this, but the thing of like the idea of the intellect, the body, the body center of like the physical center, the emotional center, and the intellectual center, that these three things out of balance, if the horse drives too fast, the cart will be destroyed. If the driver is whipping the horse out of tune, the horse will be destroyed. If the cart maintains a momentum, it will run over the horse and kill both the horse and the driver. That these three things working in concert is the ideal, but that's not the end. That at a certain point, the driver, the horse, and the cart, when working in balance, allow for the master to enter, for something else to enter. And that is a developed skill. That is not innate. And I think that's part of the kind of Sufic inheritance, or at least that lovely central plateau where like Sufism and like certain schools of Kabbalah and like Dzogchen all seem to have arrived in the kind of area of non-dualism and going that way. But the idea that mastery is not, and mastery is a very complex topic that is you can't separate it from Enlightenment theory and colonialism and slavery and all these other things that go with it. But this idea that we are building something through our work that allows for something new is important. important, I think, to not understand psychicism and witchcraft as naturally inherent in everyone, but that a skill that you might be able to develop and make up for the fact that it might not be inherent in you. And
Mm.
that isn't to say that you're going to be as good as other people. We don't know that. In the same way that I think that Buddhist maxim of like, you don't know what's going to make someone be enlightened. So like you can bemoan the fool today, but he might be more advanced than you next week.
Mm.
And like that part's real, us, for those of us of a Kingdom of the Souls kick of like that superiority is something that a lot of us inherently get off on, right? Like that's the Western magician with the intellectual thing of like all these things to study and memorize. Oh, you didn't memorize that chapter. You don't know that
Mm.
correspondence. Of course, you're more knowledgeable. Does that make you better? Not if you don't get anything with it. Uh,
Right.
um, and even then, what is better, quote unquote, quality of life, is a whole other thing. So I guess where I'm going with that is just the notion here of setting the table, setting yourself up for success to get the best connection you can repeatedly, because it won't be the same every time. And
Yeah.
there's a time where I think you and I have talked about it. I know I've talked about it with other diviners too. Like the first reading of the day is a little bit nerve-wracking. Am I on
Hmm.
or off today? Let's find out. And what do I need to do an adjustment for this client so that they still get a reading of caliber, which is where craft comes in and training. That like, if I have no inspiration today, at least I can read by the cards,
Yeah.
and give that. And it's still a reading that is based upon my experience and my knowledge in the same way that you could see a client for any number of things that we've studied, grad school or otherwise, and you can give them the facts and you can
Yeah.
start with there. And it can be an inspired lecture or it could be I got what I needed.
Yeah.
And that, also to not apologize for the fact that everything is not going to be the same every time, but to achieve a certain level of consistency is important.
Yeah.
Consistency in the performance of our divination, so that you don't have the doubt, that you don't doubt what messages are being there. So you're not doubling back and asking the same question 40 fucking times.
Right.
In the same way that record and true analysis of our divination, holding ourselves accountable of, I said this would happen and it did not happen. What changed?
Mm.
It's one thing to say, oh, the spirits were independent, off on their own that day. We're like, no, no, no. It's also how we phrase it. There are times where we damn well know if you proceed on this route, one of several things is going to happen. I'm going to tell you that the most likely thing is this or this. And one of those two things probably happens. There are other times where we predict something will happen and you're like, this is where prophecy is different than divination. It's not the study of the past anymore. Where
Yeah.
like we get a vision and be like, you're going to find a quarter in the street, go play that in the nearest lottery slot and you'll win. And it's the same thing I used to ask about Nostradamus. I'm talking about my dad a lot, interesting, about Nostradamus and like, well, how come there's always these things where it's constantly the predictions of Nostradamus? And he pointed out, if you predict something bad and it doesn't happen, nobody comes after you. They're really just relieved it didn't happen. Um, Predict something good, however, and it doesn't happen. People come after you. You said I was going to do well. So,
Yeah.
there's these things that are in not only just cold reading, but the diviner's kind of way of making sure their asses are covered,
Mm.
where like that part isn't fraudulent, but it is still a vocabulary of how we speak to each other, and how we speak to clients and how we speak to ourselves to understand divination is not perfect.
Yeah.
But through experience and relationality and through training in different systems, I've seen some divination and some divination styles be more predictably accurate.
Mm.
And is a coin flip going to be the same depth as geomancy? Well, if you figure out how to use a coin flip to develop your figures, it could be.
Yeah.
But that's using coin flip as geomancy, as opposed
Hmm.
to cards to find a trance state is very different than reading cards, as we've discussed.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I'm curious, ultimately the game of destiny as it is, what is fixed, what is not, what are the threads that we're weaving together? Is it about highest probability happening? And then, as was talked about in that talk too, it was a big thing about remediation. And I think it's wonderful to include that remediation is important. And it was a huge part of almost the system that we can tell.
Yeah.
Like it was extensive and practiced within almost any culture, except that the West lost its dependency on divination and relayed divination to parlor fortune telling,
Yeah.
where it's written about that like peeling the apple and letting the letters fall, that was as much an act of divination as going to Delphi, and you're like, this is not the same thing.
Hmm.
These things are not equal,
Yeah.
not accessing the same source. And this is where we might see folk expressions be very fascinating of people who have good spirit congress. They might not need to fast for 40 days to go into a divination trance,
Yeah.
because they have that relationship. There are other people that might need to be like, actually, I need to not eat meat for 3 days and then I can do a sitting for you and I'll do
Mm.
it. Or I need to gather my tools and go sit on the grave mound overnight and I'll tell you a
Yeah.
vision. but these are individual cultural expressions and what works for each person. I like this exploration of through all of this, what is destiny? What are the containers through which and the prisms through which we're weaving our destiny on a daily basis through our actions? I think the Kimbanda maxim, as I love to say it, of like the only thing we're a slave to is the consequences of our actions, or to bring in the Welsh triads of that lovely 16th century Druidism of like rewards and punishments are not the consequences of our actions, but the properties of them.
Mm,
And that the decision is made in the Matrix context of like the how we do something now is how we do all things. How we do something now will have an effect. It will. And trying to predict what those braids are, most of us act with certain consistencies in our character, both flawed and angelic. And we know from ourselves through self-reflection, if I do this, it's probably going to end up a certain way. Sometimes we
yeah.
need that outside advice, and there's times where I think the first psych art cult conference, as I was writing this proposal to look at divination and calendrics as I use the anthropological term is because of primitive psychology.
Mm.
And then I settled on during the writing of that lecture of like, no, it's alternative psychology. It's developing the same things through which psychology became developed in the West through the 20th century.
Right. It's not proto. It's yeah. It's an alternative
Yes.
arrangement of trying to do the same things.
Yes, and that remediation must enter into it if we're going to approach that in any holistic manner. Although it is I wouldn't say phallic. It's phallic, perhaps. It's fallacy to imply that without looking at the context of some of these divination systems, like geomancy, which does have remediations built into it, that we can look at it and see specifically, like, and I'll shout out to, like, I know Austin Coppock and Freedom Cole here, of like putting that kind of Vedic spin on things of in Western astrology of like, how do you remediate this sign in this house or this planet in this specific angle to something else? Their freedom's taking a Vedic tradition, which has an incredible living vocabulary of how to help remediate those things.
Mm.
And from what I can tell, Austin, using that in Western and also studying Vedic, but we didn't see that in common. This common talk of remediation now is still very new in my
Mm.
examination, or else it would appear in the books from the 90s. And it didn't. It did
Mm.
not appear. It's now online in Hot Topic, but it's also the same thing of like, if you can't alter what is being told to you as your destiny, there's no point in going to diviner in many traditions.
Right.
Like the whole point is that not only can the diviner alter fate by manipulating the lots themselves and pronouncing this is what will happen to you, which is very placebo or at least speaking things into existence, but there's also a whole point of now we're going to make sure that if there's a blessing, how do we secure it? If there is a bad thing, how do we avoid it as much as possible? And how to learn from this moving forward so that we can avoid making the same pitfalls.
Yeah.
And I don't see that as talked about. And maybe it's something we can include in the future. I will take a breath at some point. I'm fucking sorry. Of under geomancy and tarot, of like what are the remediation possibilities that we see in there? Because
Yeah.
often we read our tarot card and our geomantic figure in relationship to the other topics of the day,
Mm.
um, which is interesting in itself that we provided them a context. But I would love to see how we expand and complicate that because again, tarot, I do think the universality of it is a lovely way of continuing to include it in this way and building up new associations. I also love the incorporation through, especially like hoodoo inspired cartomancy with Porterfield and 52 Devils. The is it Corey
Yeah.
Hutchinson
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
of using cards as emblematic of specific containers of energy and knowledge that if you want love, put the love card up. If you're warding off death, then maybe the Ace of Spades can do prophylactic work.
Mm.
And that these cards are more than just prognosticators of doom, but can be in the same way that you're talking about before of how do you use a geometric figure? How do you find the remediation in the figure itself as to what to advance forward on, that these things become talismanic, that the tarot cards are used like this by many people, but it is still a much more personal interpretation, I believe, in the way that that's done. There are
Yeah.
books written on it, but it is not as quote unquote universal as just understanding that the high priestess deals with intuition and, the empress deals with fertility.
Mm.
Um, as those keywords are so embedded for at least 200 years, that we're still going on of like, well, if you want fertility, maybe you make a shrine around the Empress card. If you are looking for secret knowledge. What does that mean to you? Okay, maybe it's the high priestess or the devil card, and maybe it's understanding that, there are consequences to that of like invoking demons. How many punks will carry, an image of the devil card or some tarot card on their jacket, as an
Right.
indication of that otherness and that kind of like fuck you to the mainstream.
Hmm.
That is of interest to me.
Yeah. How do we wake up the signposts into its active expression of the beacon of the thing, right? How do we? When does the found stone become the amulet, right? Like
Yeah,
how does the card that significates your boss and how they're being a jerk at work become the thing that become the handle that you then access them by and that influence them and protect yourself from. Yeah, yeah, yeah,
yeah.
yeah, 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 absolutely. Yeah, yeah. Remediation as seeing the finger that points back. Um, mm, yeah.
And Geomancy provides a lovely thing with this, just with an humoral balance of like fire is active, fire is not active. Like you can do the inverse sign or the reverse sign,
Yep.
or to have the stable signs or the moving signs in these different vocabulary words that are ascribed to them, of course, and translating and speaking multiple languages doesn't help at all. But there is something beautiful of that, of like seeing that woman from Cádiz read Baraja Española and then develop figures from that, and then
Mm.
her figures to develop two independent geomantic figures through the spread that she was using, where she acknowledged she was using geomancy, but those two figures are not developed through four mothers, and therefore have the forbidden courts. Um,
Right. All
as it were.
256
Yeah,
of the dialectic patterns of one figure meeting another, rather than the 128 that get filtered through the four layers of a shield chart. Yeah.
which is beautiful because then you have this whole exposition between the the kind of orthodoxy of the half, and then the folk expression of like, I'm not doing a whole chart here. I'm reading cards, but I also know that cards in the south of Spain might have geometric influence from the north of Africa,
Yeah.
and or to read two figures to give a judge, so these two witnesses can give, which curiously you will see on an Ifa tablet, right? Of these two, they're
Hmm.
developed in different ways, in that the tops are developed the same in different ways, or different timings, but you still have two characters that modify the first, or two characters that give rise to a second. Uh,
Yeah. That's something I'd be fascinated to look at in future episodes. Is not just geomantic figures, but also geomantic techniques, maybe, like especially where we find witnesses in different ways, and how
yeah,
we derive one thing from another. Yeah. Also, love the would love to talk more about like that kind of short throws of two figures, and its derived dialectical third, its synthesis. Because that's some fascinating stuff in terms of like it seems quicker, and it is, than setting a whole chart, obviously, but it requires double the amount of knowledge about
yes,
like what all 256 of those triads mean, as
yes.
opposed to just the 128 that you. Yeah. When is it shorthand that you can do because you know where the books are on the shelf and can just reach for them, and when does it look like more effort to look up the formal Dewey Decimal System and remind yourself of that, and then go get that thing? Like, what are we saving time on, and also like, what do we need? What's the deeper experience that we need in order to be quicker?
Yes. I think there's a beauty in that, of that echoing of like the folk by necessity, which we'll get into
Mm,
with definitions of my analysis of New World traditions, right? Because it's nothing. You're impure by being born in the New World. You're not from the Old World, and therefore nothing ever holds up the same way. Even though you don't have a choice but to speak in the language of the inherited colonization and descriptions of things through a Western lens, but also that in order to phrase even your indigenous knowledge that you end up having to, or enslaved African knowledge, that it ends up having to meet through the common parlance and the common tongue
mm,
of what these Western magics are, which this commingling and wonderful misogynization is the sweet spot for me of study, like that synchronization, both as a cultural force and both willingly engaged with, but also the creolization, the pigeonization of things that happens there. That you can't. For all our talk of liminality, you can't live in a liminal state at all times. You're not standing
Right.
at all times, and if you are, then you have actually walked into a different state of being, but you're no longer liminal if it's normal.
Right.
Um,
Yeah. You want to reiterate the things you've talked about before about like liminality, into and out of hybridity?
I mean, I think just even mentioning in that way of like the difference between synchronization versus Creole and Pidgin, and we're talking about hybridity, which is we're bringing in biological and linguistic terms to describe states of performance of life, whether it's anthropological discussions of things, and you see Turner talking about that going into even Schechner's analysis of how these things work, but that you can be both things, but that is your identity that those of us that have multiple inheritances culturally or racially or religiously or whatever those things are, you can pick one, but your inheritance is both. Like it doesn't mean you have access to both unless you make yourself have access to both. But if you want to use the doorway metaphor of liminality, standing between the spirit world and this world is all fine and dandy. If you are someone who is always in that position, then that's your new state. That's not a door. That you're
Mm.
just half in and half out compared to everyone else. But there are multiple doors for everyone. And I think that that's an important side of it too. That like I don't know what because I don't want to rag on people's use of the term, but when people self-identify as liminal witchcraft and what that means, I was like, that's all spirit contact should be relying on what this concept of the threshold is and how
Mm.
to move through it. But I'd be very curious for people to talk about what they mean by that indifference to how other people work or why that's the thing they identify with. But
Mm.
hybridity is an identity based upon multiple parts that you can walk through. You could be both, walking through the spirit world and the physical world, and you figured out a way where you don't bump into everything and you're able to make your bills meet, and you don't suffer from massive ADHD complexes. But and not just on Paris Hilton's new, ADHD is a superpower soundtrack. But I just think it is. I mean, the minute we label and calcify anything, it starts to die, right? This is a thing. The more we can think of these labels as verbs and
Mm.
their understanding of they're performing something, for me, is always going to hold more. That if something is liminal, is because it is literally liminalizing right now.
Mm.
In that same way that hmm, there's this idea of the lack of to be in Semitic languages before it's through a Western lens can mean much more reliance upon the verb, on the specificity of the verb, rather than to describe things as a state of being, which belongs to
Mm.
God. That
Mm.
God is, and everything else just is performing that deity. It is
Isness. Mm.
yeah, that isness, that reification of deification of all things at all times, and therefore it supplies a unity of God that is the true radical monotheism, right? That like that is to be able to comprehend, as David Chaim Smith has said in a lecture, and I'll repeat because I can't remember where he got it from, but God is one but not in counting.
Mm.
The unity of something is very different than the idea that there is one thing,
Mm.
and that comes after nothing and comes before two. And this, I think that our relationship to liminality, hybridity, syncretism, pigeon, Creole, all these things, that the idea of going from a pigeon, which is two things interacting and borrowing from each other to make a third identity, that by the time that gets codified, it becomes creolized and becomes much more communication must experiment. It throws itself out there, and it needs to be echoed back in order for it to become something that can have a force of movement. And I think
Mm.
our magic is very similar. We gain confidence by doing magic, and we gain magic by doing magic. It's a momentum. It's a trajectory. It's an avalanche of and gravity and a gravitas by where we're pulling things into that momentum that we have. Some of that is borrowed from tradition, that if I say this the right way, it should work. Some of it is borrowed from aesthetic. Some of it is borrowed from lovely amounts of heresy and taboo. If you know me, I'm a big advocate for heresy, not necessarily blasphemy. Blasphemy and healing, yes, but heresy is heresy is the true witch power. Uh, Whisper in my, eat this fruit and become like gods. God damn it. Heresy could be. But I don't know. I think that's really what I'm after there. I don't mean to. It's funny because this discussion tonight, even of or today or whatever this is, the 40th hour of our limbo is interesting because it brings up just as much fruit as I was worried that it would get too broad.
Mm.
And I think quite the opposite. It's really fun to talk about these things on a broad level through specificity.
Yeah.
I'm curious in the same way that, the last like hurdle, I think, talking about this, if we're standing in the doorway of our last topic, which is dead magicians, and
Mm.
inherently ties itself to what is folk necromancy. And it's something that this term, when I heard you utter it, has always captivated me. And it's something that whether or not you created it or not, you're the person who exposed me to that term. And still can't find anybody that used it before you. But it's interesting how the folking of things became very popular a few years later, right? Everything became folk this, folk that.
Mm.
Um, we do have folk art and things like that, but this concept of folk necromancy in relationship to dead magicians ties into the orthodoxy and orthopraxis, I suppose, of what makes a saint, what makes a demon as a personal identity, what's the personhood of a demon is a whole other interesting exploration.
Yeah.
But dead magician, we have explored both historical figures we can be 99% certain were real. Never met Sybil Leek, nor have I seen her grave plot or dug up her body. But we have enough record to assume that, unless I'm living in an alternate timeline, that Sybil Leek was a real, living, breathing person. But when we talk about things like Merlin or Circe, we're talking about things that are more legendary. We don't know how much is based upon a historical record or an ahistorical record at that, or how much is answering the value center of a people or the romantic ideals of a people. I think that exploration of Dead Magician is wonderful because it blurs on what it kind of gives a fuck you to the ivory tower of magic and allows us to engage with those who are like us, even in fantastical comparison. And I'm not advocating for a lack of sanity, but sometimes being a little insane is, closer to genius. But just don't be an asshole when it comes down to it.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, so I'm curious both your take on or your exploration permutation post 2017 because this is 2024 towards the end. We're talking, what is that? 7 years?
Yeah.
Um,
Blimey.
7 years of this podcast. Finally hit 40. Um, our relationship and friendship has multiplied and generated whole worlds of love for each other, unabashedly. And I think that one of the strengths of this show is our camaraderie and our making fun of ourselves and each other and kind of going through it. And it all reminds me of the picture that we use on the webpage of being in was it the Fleece?
Yeah, the
Uh,
Fleece. Yeah, one of the
uh,
oldest pubs.
yeah, of just like that, or being with being with Jake in Cornwall, and just like I don't have the stomach for it because I am not a drinker, but this notion of the kind of wonderful, just constant talking over pints about what we love.
Yeah.
Um, and the fact that by in and of itself is folking of something because it's talking. And one of the reasons that I think that it's fun for us as a podcast, that even though we both write, that writing papers on each of these topics would be a very different thing. And
Yeah.
even we're talking about in possible future worlds having supplemental material like our fucking mythic footnotes that we've talked about since the first episode, but prove elusive, and we would like to do them because it's listening to an episode and putting in like, oh, that's this book I'm talking about, or I don't know what the fuck I was talking about here. But I do think they'd be valuable. As I talked to you earlier, like there's the eternal sunshine of the ADHD mind and how we'll go off on anything and do everything. Episodes could be 20 hours long or they could be a half hour long.
Yeah.
We found it really challenging to talk about even the 7 topics in the beginning, because I think we approached it more like a book report and trying to share information. But
Yeah.
I think over time, the podcast for me and talking with you about these topics also shifted the way that I talk about things on the daily, in that it like I would rather give key to look up something and find their knowledge on it, like give enough context for something, but also be able to talk on the level with you of like, okay, if I don't know something, I'm going to interrupt you. Like, can you summarize that real quick?
Yeah.
But otherwise, like the depths of conversation by assuming that everyone has access to a way to look these things up more. And if we can help with that with footnotes in the future, we I think we can and should. But as
Yeah.
we progress forward of like this investigation of praxis, of invocation, of even divination on a different level, of what that can be, the challenge of writing the folk is interesting to me.
Yeah.
Um, just the folk with orality and as well as folk with heretical, are two mainstays of what we filter things through. Uh,
Yeah. Yeah.
but
Yeah.
that talk of which is on the website too, with Ben, that we did for the Salem Witchcraft and Folklore Festival, of different aspects of what this folk necromancy is, but is still a very, I think it's an idea and a current of which I would love to continue to explore with you in both the podcast and other levels and ways of doing it. But this is my long introduction preamble to I would love you why, what, and how folk necromancy on the broad level, knowing where we've come since 2017 and
Mm.
where you've come from even thinking about the term, if that's not too much to ask.
No, not at all. Not at all. I think one of the things that I like a lot of things about folk necromancy. I like folk as punk. We talked a little bit about with Ben as well as orality, like we've talked about, as practical, as folk magic, as not just dirty magic not done properly, but rather like the grassroots from which hieratic arts often complicate and pontificate from after filing the serial numbers off, but also as something that we can keep returning to and considering and reconsidering. I think, yeah, the last 7 years of doing this podcast and the chats we get to have about it and our plans for it and things like that are some of the things that have most like helped me appreciate this this set of conceptions of something that started as a partly like a way of describing and exploring the more quotidian interactions between the livings and the dead, and that, you know, especially with this segment, the dead the dead magicians, like this historical appreciation of the magicians and witches and weirdos that came before us, really opens up a bunch of stuff around how all history gets to be necromantic, at least a little bit, at least as a treat, right? That which goes into so many directions, but like one of the things that I'm continually grateful for, one of the many things that you bring to the table every time we sit down in our digital limbo pub space and chat about this, is that in the way that like world music is a daft category, it's all folk music, right? There's a sense of that, like our folk necromancy and its explorations gets to be world necromancy, gets to be both appreciations, considerations of different peoples, different cultures, approaches to the dead and the returned and the ancestralized and the spooky, but that can take some very tangible like historical approaches. Like I love the way that you will almost always bring up the actual like economic history of a mineral, of like where it's from and how we got to get it, the logistics of that, the history and practices of trade and cultural exchange, but also like empire and colonialism, and how the supposedly new is very often only new to a bunch of people who are the ones writing in the language everyone has to speak, like that kind of stuff. That increasingly, you know, fascinates me, and also the way that it becomes a folk necromancy becomes a lens through which to understand the transmission of the things of this Cosa Nostra we call magic, right? Whether we're talking about the inherent necromancy of reading, of like the grand conjuration from dead trees, or the generosity and the respect and openness of footnoting of where we get our ideas and our praxis from, and how exploring personal connection with the dead, with our dead, with our deads, with the ancestors, with some ancestors, with deceased practitioners, gets to be about gratitude and appreciation, but also actually working by their light and what that means, and that light as inspiration, which shouldn't be undervalued, and I don't think we do. I think we're good at that, but also at least occasionally, like as the tangible influence of the dead, right? And again, we're back to like the requirements of rigorous divination, of trained mediumship, of relationality with other spirits or other practices that can facilitate and offer containers and protocols for engaging with the dead in that manner, right? That we get to talk about the demonology of necromancy, that we get to talk about the hagiography of necromancy, and vice versa as well. That these aren't just about playing word games with a medievalist conception; they're also about like this broad umbrella that we get to put up, and a table we get to lay as well. I love that analogy. How we can think about collections of dead magicians as well as individuals. The umbrella muster point of my beloved three magi, but also like variated collectives, and how we can appreciate in understanding the folkness of something, or the folking is probably better, like the verb of it. The just as like variation is a sign of a living practice, it's also a sign of unliving influence, I think. Not just all the capital D dead who did magic as if it was the same. I think the kind of meeting of the historical and the grassroots of this is in the way it gives us opportunities for thinking and working with the forgotten, or the simply less well-known practitioners, like the unknown witch of this region, or the cunning woman who never got arrested, right, and didn't get written about. I think these concerns about bottom-up history as necromancy and necromancy as history are important. As well as how it allows us to understand the importance of relationality with powers that we might call like lords and ladies of the graveyard, as well as like, I don't know, like ghost bouncers and the other kind of like go-betweens and intermediaries that we might work with to facilitate this work. Yes, for like operational efficacy, but also, once again, for our own organization and coordination. I think that's the stuff I've been kind of considering in general about this. And again, like it's these conversations that have provided a wonderful container and alembic and prodding and call to dance that's been that I just really appreciate. That means that we get to keep doing this, and that we keep reflecting on that we get to continue to reflect on how our conception of approach to this work can develop and change, precisely because it is rooted in this polyvalent grassroots conception of the many voices of the dead that sometimes produce beautiful harmonies. It is something that I think, again, has a strength in its idiosyncrasies, in the uniqueness of things, in the cyclical nature of stuff. Like it again gets to be a lens through which other lenses kind of get to, like the, what do you call it, the gobo, the gel on the stage lights, right, that gets to illuminate other things, that gets to show the depth of color in things that and even in other lenses and other techniques that are there, like the hauntology of it as well. It continues to like fascinate me, how a thing done before gets to and done again and again at that place gets to be a way in which we can still read the text of a place, or of a relationality, or of a people's, or of an individual, or of a life, or of a time period, when it's being written over by so many people doing so many things, the palimpsest of reality, that when the words line up and you write the same word over that same word again and again, there's a clarity there and a sense of like not just feeling a connection to the past, but being part of an ongoing. Yeah, that everything is all haunted as hell, and hope, and we get to navigate what of those gets to be beneficial for ourselves and for others, and that kind of benefit model isn't just about like power in the moment, or even like, oh, God's enlightenment, or the superiority that can come from thinking you're enlightened, but the idea of training to be a good ancestor ourselves. That it isn't just a formal thing of the dead take this and don't take that, or you have to stand this certain way, but about like how do we stand if the dead are all around us all the time? How do we walk forwards? And in much the same way that you've talked about some of your reflections and the meanings for you that have come up in your Santa Muerte practice about like how do we walk towards our deaths, how do we walk with our deaths at our side, and how do we train to be good ancestors ourselves someday? I think I continue to find new enrichment from how considering and acting in a folk necromantic set of manners gets to enrich life without trying to be too grand about it. How we navigate the hauntology of things. That's my earliest quote magical experiences as a kid were less seeing a particular ghost, although I caught a few, but much more the sense of the thronging ambience of things that had come before that tilted how a room felt or tainted how a space was, or made me feel that things I was feeling weren't just inside me and that were like flowing in and out, and that I was part of something bigger and weirder. And I think folk necromancy continues to help me elucidate some of that stuff. Talking about the things in childhood that we continue to work out, whether by therapist or scrying stone.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
that's beautiful. I think a lot about and I can hear you in my head because you've used this repeatedly of like why necromancy, of just the proximity of relationality between the dead and the living, that they know what we go through, they know what we are about, that there's certainly more sympathy because we are the same species as it is than perhaps a deity or an angel or even a demon.
I've been there, man.
So and that relationality again is interesting across the board because again, again, I'm same emphatic words. I'm sorry. I like that through the lens of exploring dead magicians take a shot, that it truly lies at the heart of this whole exploration of folk necromancy. In addition to queering, folking, folk necromantizing our materia, our understanding of saints, our understanding of magic in general, to be, I think, dead magicians. Although I would say folk necromancy is the lens through which we are guilty of no matter what in this prismatic way. Dead magicians is the impetus for that lens, and I think that's beautiful. In our language, we don't say. Anyway,
we say, grave friend we haven't met yet.
Yeah.
I mean that does. I think
future obsessory spirit. But
from one future corpse to a currently.
Yeah. I especially like it can feel sometimes when we select a person, it's like, yes, there's the like, I wish people knew more about this one. It's really fun to do a well-known one too. It's really fun to have given voice to a decided lack of female necromancers and magicians in the profiles of things half the time, even though that's where the imagination goes as far as witchcraft and demonic works goes, right? The wickedness of women. Good for them. But there's I'm curious. I'm curious where it all goes in the sense of what future ways we can complicate this thing. I certainly love the invocation of Jake's memory of any of our teachers of Abiel, of Zanthi, of these people who have been pivotal in my life, of my grandmother, of the santeros and himanderos that form my lineage in that way. We always build upon the dead, this idea, right, of the democracy of the dead that is tradition, as well as the notion of setting new fires, not smothering with ashes.
Yes.
Absolutely necessary. I would be curious, I don't propose any huge changes to what we do. I love the way our format works. What is the grand schema of things that we might add? I do foresee a possibility of like a beast of an explanation
Mm.
of both imaginary and quote unquote non-imaginary beast, because I think it's beautiful when you look through things of like, a medieval description of a porcupine is going to be very different.
There's so much, yeah, there's so much to that, like the way we can talk about like the natural history as well as the natural magic of zoology, that like, for the folks who've you've never seen a giraffe before, you're going to describe it by animals that you do know. There's something very existential and phenomenological about that, about like using what we already know to talk about what we don't yet know.
Yeah.
That as a basis of creativity itself. Or at least um, I drop things about the heraldry of stuff, about the emblematics of things,
Yes.
because we both have something of an aversion to ways in which symbolic can be used in a kind of reductive way. But like to actually get into the heraldry of like animals and like, yes, the rules of when you can and can't use, a tincture, or the medievalist, which is more early modern, right? Medievalist, not medieval, conceptions of literal heraldry, but also thinking about animals as living mandala, as instantiations of virtue, of virtuing, not just as repositories of things, not just as again, things to be bioprospected. Beasts excites me immensely. And
Yeah.
especially if we're going to get folk necromantic with that as well, and talk about like, what does it mean to work with fox, or the fox, or the first
Yes.
fox?
I think that that's an
Um,
important spin of it, is not just well, in the same way that none of our presentation of material should ever just be the historical. I
mm,
think what makes it good is like personal experience and story around things, or aversion, or like I fucking hate that, or I have an attraction to this and I don't know why. Uh,
yeah.
and I think that um, part of that is that I think one of the things that has kept us going, even when we've had great delays in um, publishing an episode, is that we have fun talking about this shit. So like,
Mm-hmm.
how do we make it more fun? Um, But the other thing, in addition to, because if we cover animal, vegetable, mineral, which is the simplicity of that, right? That like
Mm.
we have the classes of dead human and sainted human and demon, whatever
Mm.
the interactions of those things are. We have two geomantic things, two divination things, which could be any number of things, but those are a very universal language in the Western occult, and one that is, I think, specific to you, and then expands to include things that are near and dear to both of us as far as geomancy, and the expansion into understanding of it as world geomancy, not just Western European geomancy, um, and
Yeah.
appreciation for that thing. I also am curious what it would be like to add. I don't know what the category is. I think sky thing, because it's not a star, it's not an asterism, it's not a planet, it's not a constellation, it's not a specific zodiacal or astrological election, but it could be any of those things, because in addition to fixed stars or planets, it might be nice to occasionally be like, okay, we're going to talk about Jupiter today on
Mm.
as far as Jupiterian things. But it also could be very specific to talk about a fixed star and go that route, or even Mars in Scorpio as
Yeah.
a thing. And again, we might go broad and get more specific in time, but I think that this is a nice way of kind of adding to the onion layers of what we have here, of animal, vegetable, mineral, two different types of dead humans, a demon, um, a
Yeah.
sky thing. I don't
Yeah.
necessarily feel the need to be like, let's add an angel into all of this as well. Sometimes we do angels through saints, like the biblical ones, but I don't necessarily know if I want to do the celestial beings quite as of yet, unless
Mm.
we're going to include like the wide carnivorous sky of weird sci-fi and fantastical old gods that will, ascend, descend, and kill us all.
Well,
Uh,
this is something I wanted to raise. Like, I would love to make more space for talking about the kind of Mesoamerican astrologies and calendricals that that I know you're very passionate about, and have been exploring, and how this gets to be reflections on time, and and as a lovely corollary to the kind of kairos of saint feasts, as well as what that says about, you know, the cosmologies and the practices of those peoples that you know, engaged in those observations and lived their lives by them.
Yeah, I've you know, I've heard you say that before, but I didn't necessarily want it. But it's interesting. Now, like, you know, there's 20-day signs. It's interesting enough to explore those on their own terms. It's similar to tarot. Like, you know, if I don't like them, I'll say like, yeah, I don't want to talk about this anymore, or we'll move through them. I do think that they're interesting. They can bring up interesting things, so I'm happy to maybe in one of the next upcoming episodes we can discuss Mesoamerican calendrics and like the, you know, broad overview, to be able to reference it, but also as a day sign, that is fascinating. Like, you're talking about a huge amount of Central America relying on a very similar calendar system as to understanding, at least as far as the 260-day rotation.
Mm.
It influences a lot of things, and is used for divination as well. So there's something there. Sure, it could be very
Yeah.
interesting to talk about and see how it expands and contracts and goes back and forth. Yeah, I love the idea of, I mean, we've talked about it. I don't know if it will take the form of exactly like a Patreon or something like that, but I do love the idea of expanding and promoting a community of people that want to talk about more in-depth things within these topics, as well as providing the material for praxis and invoke. And I would love to go back and who knows what various funding we can look for of going back and doing the first 40 episodes and, you know, collecting praxis and invoke upon those things, as well as footnotes, and how can we present that in a way that is both aesthetically pleasing, because that's, I can't start anything unless it's, I know the aesthetic of it, but also just the pride I personally feel for what we've done, and for all the buffoonery and amazing insights as well. Like, fuck yeah, like, never thought I'd love doing Saint Demon zine covers so much for every episode. It's
Yeah,
a lot of fun.
the development of the art over time, and the tricks and the little like visual puns and the placing of things
Yeah.
becomes has been wonderful. Yeah.
So I guess also this puts it out there to you, and I will even be honest here and know that we do have a really lovely group of listeners and Golgothites listening. It's weird to call them by Golgothites. I apologize for the cringe that just gave me, but it's cute all the same. Golgothans, Golgothites, Golgothuds. But you know, if you have any ideas, like, please, we do love hearing from you. We do love the interaction. You know, we're both shy, and you know, when someone says this was the shittiest episode ever, which no one has ever said, but we do wonder who the thumbs down is every time. Uh, you know, keeps me guessing.
Right.
Um, but the idea of like, I like Beast, I like Sky Thing. I don't know what the fuck that actually is, but Sky Thing is just as accurate as anything.
Mm.
Day Sign, perhaps there's a couple others that we'll think of in the next, but I love the idea of modifying and saying, you know what, for the next 10 episodes we're going to try these. Um,
Mm.
it allows us to kind of back off on going so in depth with tarot, but allowing to have certain flashes of it come through.
Mm.
I think geomancy will always be interwoven in everything we do, because I think it is such a I like the use of making geomancy as universal as tarot,
Mm.
at least in what we do.
Mm.
I think it's a tribute to your work, and it speaks to the efficacy of things in the same way that demons for us have both been and from any number of Western grimoires, but also have been chosen sometimes to explore the corresponding Kimbanda spirit through the Grimoire Verum synchronizations through Fontenelle.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
I think,
I'm eternally like inspired and grateful that we get to like explore these crossroads of where those things the creative frictions of them, and the points where the points of the earth kind of line up to, like you were saying, like a where you can glimpse the common root, where Rammel went in one direction, and European geomancy got all astrological with things, and Odu preserved, amongst other things, preserved folk tales and stories and parables and pathikeen, and I love being able to have those meetings of worlds and of approaches and traditions.
It's interesting is how wonderfully Osirian Christian mystery is it of us to use, like, if you don't know the Golgotha hymn, it is what is echoed in the theme song that we do use, which is said to be a Coptic tune that was used for the mummification of pharaohs that was then transplanted onto with a Christian narrative in time. And I love that kind of dual layers in that way. And it's sung every Good Friday in many churches, but especially the Coptic, and it's originally a Coptic hymn. I love this idea that by going fully folk necromantic, it teaches us how to engage with our traditions as living traditions. That it really is reddening the bones of these things, that it takes them in my own metaphors of the past, of looking at like language itself as the clay with which we shape the little golems of our world, right? So what kind of God are you, that you're animating what you know and what you don't know through the vowels of spoken speech to animate the consonants of the original Semitic texts. But in this case, like, all reading is an act of necromancy, and you are bringing something to life, and your knowledge and praxis and breath itself, which is for me one of the most divine things we have, the thing that we shape, that exists. Our breath existed before us, right? This is the original God across the face of the abyss. We are breathing the original substance of creation. And we continue to shape that and change it through our words, through our practice. And I love this. There's nothing more necromantic than making something live again. And even if we knew it, and it's still, we might know, to keep going on, these poor stone and herb, we might know dandelion and bloodstone really fucking well, but every time you use it, it should teach you something new. And even if it's just reifying the strength of its relationship. But I love that our knowledge of bloodstone and dandelion is necromantic by its nature, that we resurrect it, that we tell it how to live a new life, even for this small purpose that we are doing, that we are accessing and changing or creating a vocabulary whereby, yes, we're talking about form and noose and just how things work, but we're phrasing it through this constant language of necromancy. And for me, the reddening of the bones by our living breath, which the bones of our texts, the bones of our traditions, the bones of our desires, how do we flesh them out, literally? How do we add things to it in the same way that, for me, one of the things I think about, Rosa, one of my primary La Muerte teachers, used to talk about, when I ask her about the colors of the robes and things, she's like, yes, there are colors that are more considered older by many people, but at the same time, your whole job in this world is to cloak your death in your life. Like this, we color our death by how we live. And similarly, we are coloring our praxis by what we choose to resurrect, what we choose to give life to, where we put our attention on a very basic level. And whether we want to explore that kind of Gurdjieffian, where attention goes, consciousness follows, or perhaps building the body of light from a Sufic perspective, or allowing the master to enter the coach, or any number of things, but that consulting the dead of our memory, the dead of the land, the dead of wherever we are, allows us to bring life to them, not just in our thought, but in our praxis, in our words, in our passions, and how we live.
Yeah. That's beautiful. Yeah. And
mummies all around, mummies all the way down.
Right. That these again, mysteries doesn't have to mean a secret society of I've got the answers and I'm gonna make you work for them. But the thing that we call the infinitely renewable resources of returning to begin again, of resurrecting, of remembering, of rearticulating, of keeping the songs going, of keeping the fire going. Yeah, like you said, the relationality and the relationshiping of returning to your bloodstones, to your to your dandelions, and being reminded of what not only brought you to them, but where you've gone, where you are, and where you're going.
Yeah. There's this. Oh, I'm not going to go Deleuzian because then I'll be made fun of. Um, but even the remembering here, right? Like literally remembering of the arm of dandelion and the left toe of bloodstone and
Mm,
the rib of oil lamp. That it is ultimately our relationality, our sensorium, and our desire meeting through, it's giving a head to that body, those body
yeah,
parts. That these things by themselves do not move forward except without. And of course, this is all lovely coming from someone who believes, Orisha idea of Ori and the supremacy of the head in the body, but it is the head that guides the body. And because I will prove it by my own proving it. Um, but outside that rigidity, of course, I'll fight that later. But the idea that the gift of alignment and purpose and knowing which way to walk is really what many of us are after in all of our practices with Kimbanda divination, to see what our agency is in any given moment and what are the choices I have and which one gets me the most advantage in moving forward.
yeah,
With Orisha, perhaps to utilize my resources to live the best life I can so that I can manifest the things that my head wants to do in this world. Whether it's witchcraft and this quote unquote stealing of power is to have more agency, to be able to do what we want in the world. There's less morality, perhaps, to that, but I think that there's an intrinsic reliance upon relationality and to understand the relationships between these things, that the body parts of our practice are not separate, that we are stitching them together, Frankensteining them, Sally the Patchwork Girling them in
mm,
order to guide them through the vision that we see so that we can look through this um, full body mask that we wear of our praxis, of our ingredients, and move forward through the work that we do to take the next step. Lots too much poetry there. Uh,
but what better place to be reminded of the the agency of the head that forges and looks ahead than the place of the skull.
yes, exactly. Yeah, absolutely. Ah, good on that. Okay, now I feel less trite, and perhaps just more in alignment. What in the true um, Alexander technique, not Alexandrian idea of how much less can I do to maintain
Mm,
what I need to get done.
mm,
Don't overcomplicate. Um,
yeah,
but with that, I think we've had a lovely little permutation down this road. This
yeah.
pilgrimage towards Golgotha. I appreciate the the time as always, Al, but I appreciate your brain so much and your articulation of it. And here's to numerous groups of 40 episodes more. But
Oh yeah.
thank you for providing the fuel for me to want to keep doing it. Of just it's the digital pub, as it were, or the virtual the astral pub, and the weird Frankensteining of our bodies as we move forward. And uh, yeah, so as well as thank you to our listeners, um, whether you be one or infinite. Uh, Please do continue to check us out. So radiofreegolgotha.com. We are in discussion of what the next speakeasy will be and when it will be.
Mm,
So check out Speakeasy of the Dead as well. .com, which is really just a subsection of radiofreegolgotha.com. You can find us on the Library AF, known as Facebook, under Folk Necromancy as the group title. Co-moderated also with Ben Jaffe, who's just fucking fantastic. Um, and please look at our list of talks and things like this. Your personal website is what, Al?
AlexanderCummins.com.
All right. And I am jessehathawaydiaz.com, and trying to continue updating with classes and things that I'm doing. And please go take a bunch of Al's classes and argue with him because he loves it. Uh, and yeah, so I think we covered everything in in that way.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and big thank you to uh, Mark and Cooper, who have changed our lives as far as being able to get episodes out.
Oh my goodness, yes.
And so, as long as we can have other people edit the podcast, it is much easier for us who are less editor in that way, obviously. um,
No.
Thank you for making this possible, Mark and Cooper. Mark for all of last year and for several of the episodes of this year, and for Cooper taking over. We appreciate it. Appreciate everything you're doing to help us there. And yeah. And I don't want to. I'm ending on the rambling. Blah, 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 blah. Remember me for my good poetry, not for my.
No, I think you've summed up well. Yeah, again, hopefully folk necromancy gets to teach us about a gratitude attitude and the inspirations we can derive from getting to talk about that stuff. Certainly, very grateful to you, Jesse, and to again to Mark and Coop for helping us do this thing we do, and to everyone who listens and shares them as well. It's been a joy to do, and has been a greater joy, and like the star of the Magi, a joy upon a joy upon a joy. So hopefully much more to come. And thanks for joining us for this little 40th episode birthday party where we've got to reflect on all the fun things that we want to do next, and how they're gonna turn out and continue to grow and develop and change and ramble.
Ramble child. All right. With that, Bob's your uncle, and good night and good luck. Happy 40th to us all, each and every one.
Beginning is a delicate thing. A beginning again is a delicate thing.